There is a pair of hands you have never thought about. They belong to a woman who lived roughly 7,000 years ago in what is now southern Germany. We do not know her name. We do not know the sound of her voice or the colour of her eyes, or what she dreamed about when the night got cold and the embers in the hearth sank low and the only warmth left was the body of a child pressed against her side. We do not know if she sang. We do not know if she laughed easily, or if she carried a sadness in her chest that she never spoke about, because there was no word for it in her language, or because there was no time. But we know one thing about her with absolute scientific certainty, because her bones told us. Her arms were stronger than those of a modern Olympic rower. Not slightly stronger, not comparable, not impressive for her era, significantly, measurably, undeniably stronger. The bones of her upper arms, her humeri, had been reshaped by years of repetitive, grueling daily labour, so intense that when researchers at the University of Cambridge placed her skeletal measurements beside those of women who row competitively for one of the most elite boat clubs on Earth, women who train twice a day and cover 120 kilometres of water every week, the prehistoric woman's arms exceeded theirs by 11 to 16%. And she was not unusual. She was not a champion. She was not extraordinary by the standards of her world. She was average. This is the part of human history no one told you. Not because it was lost, not because the evidence did not exist, but because for over a century, the people studying ancient bones were comparing women's skeletons to men's, and when women's bones looked less dramatic than men's, they assumed the women had done less. They assumed the women had led smaller lives, quieter lives, easier lives. They assumed wrong. The women did not do less. Their bones simply respond to strain differently, more internally, more subtly, less visibly. And when scientists finally compared ancient women's bones to modern women's bones, created a female-specific baseline for the first time in the entire history of bioarchaeology, the truth that emerged was so startling, so fundamentally world-altering, that one of the lead researchers gave it a name that belongs in the title of every history textbook ever printed. She called it a hidden history. This is that history, the real, an evidence-based, bone-deep, tooth-worn, hand-stenciled history of what early women actually did, all day, every day, for thousands upon thousands of years. And I promise you, it is nothing like what you were taught. It is bigger, it is harder, it is more astonishing, and it will change the way you think about your own body, your own hands, and the women who came before you. Picture a morning, not a modern morning, not an alarm, not coffee, not the blue light of a phone screen in a dark bedroom. A morning 7,000 years ago, in the fertile lowlands of Central Europe, in a settlement of perhaps 40 or 50 souls, where the houses are built of timber and daub, and the roofs are thick with bundled reeds that need replacing every few years. The air smells of wood smoke and damp earth, and the faint, sweet rot of last season's grain stores, that musty, yeasty scent that means the emmer wheat is still edible, but will not last another month. A woman wakes. She's somewhere in her late 20s, which in this era does not mean what it means now. It means she has already survived more than most modern humans will ever face. She has survived childhood fevers without antibiotics, fevers that took one of her siblings before that sibling could walk. She has survived at least 2 pregnancies, maybe 3, and the births that came with them, births without anaesthesia, without surgical intervention, without anyone to call if something went wrong except the older women who had done this before, and who knew which herbs to press against the belly and which positions ease the passage and which prayers to whisper when the blood would not stop. She has survived winters so cold that the river froze solid enough to walk across, and the livestock huddled so close together for warmth that the pens steamed in the morning air. She has survived summers so hot that the grain withered in the fields, unless it was watered by hand, bucket after bucket after bucket, carried from the stream on aching shoulders. She does not think of herself as surviving. She thinks of herself as living. This is what living looks like. This is what it has always looked like. The only version of existence she knows is one where your body is the primary tool, where rest is something that happens when the light fails, and where the line between thriving and starving is measured in bushels of grain and weeks of weather. Her hands are the first thing you would notice if you could see her. They are not soft. They are not delicate. They are thick across the palms, calloused in patterns that modern hands simply never develop. Calluses at the base of each finger, across the heel of the hand, along the outer edge of the wrist, at the tips of the thumb and forefinger where they pinch and grip. The skin is rough and cracked in places, stained with the reddish-brown residue of ochre pigment and the grey dust of ground stone. These are the hands of someone who has spent hours every single day, not occasionally, not when it was convenient, but every day, pressing her body weight down onto rock, because that is the first thing she will do this morning, the same way she did it yesterday and the day before and the day before that, and every day stretching backward through years, since she was old enough to kneel beside her mother and learn the motion, since she was perhaps 6 or 7 years old, watching the older women work, mimicking the push and pull, building the calluses that would protect her palms for the rest of her life. She will grind grain. She crosses the packed earth floor of her home in the grey light before dawn. The floor is cool beneath her bare feet, slightly damp from the night air that seeps through the walls. She steps over the sleeping form of a child, her youngest, maybe 2 years old, curled on a reed mat beneath a hide blanket, breathing with that soft, wet rhythm that small children have when they sleep deeply. The older children are already stirring. A girl of 8 or 9 is awake, sitting up, watching her mother move. She knows the routine. She will help soon. Niam. The woman moves to the place near the entrance of the house where 2 stones sit waiting. They are always there. They are among the most important objects this family owns. The bottom stone is large, flat, slightly concave from years of use, worn into a shallow bowl shape by 10,000 hours of friction. The surface pitted and scarred and smoothed in alternating patterns that tell the story of its use more clearly than any written record. The top stone is smaller, oval, rounded on the underside, heavy enough that lifting it requires the engagement of both hands and the muscles of the forearms. This is a saddle quern. It has no moving parts. It requires no fuel, no maintenance, no repair. It requires only a human body and the willingness to use it. It is one of the most important tools in the Neolithic world, and it is, by every measure we can apply, almost certainly a woman's tool. She kneels on the hard-packed floor. She reaches into a clay storage vessel and withdraws a handful of emmer wheat, the kernels small and tough, enclosed in their husks, resistant to being turned into anything edible without enormous effort. She pours the grain onto the lower stone. She grips the upper stone with both hands. She positions her knees, squares her shoulders, engages the muscles of her core, and she begins. The motion is this. Both hands grip the upper stone firmly. She pushes it forward across the surface of the lower stone, pressing down hard with the full weight of her shoulders, her chest, her abdomen. The grain is caught between the 2 surfaces and crushed, but it does not crush easily. Emmer wheat is not soft modern flour wheat. The kernels are dense, protected by tough husks, and they resist being reduced to powder with a stubbornness that must have been maddening. Each handful of grain requires dozens of passes, forward, back, the upper stone scraping across the lower in a rhythm that engages the deltoids, the triceps, the latissimus dorsi, the erector spinae, the obliques, the deep stabilizers of the core. It is, in biomechanical terms, one of the most demanding repetitive upper body tasks a human being can perform, more demanding than rowing, more demanding than competitive swimming, more demanding than anything a modern gym offers, and she will do this for 5 hours today, not because she is punished, not because she is enslaved, not because some authority has assigned her this task and she has no choice, but because this is what it takes to feed a family in the early agricultural world. There is no alternative. There is no easier method. The rotary quern, the hand mill that will eventually make grain grinding faster and less physically devastating, will not be invented for another 3,000 years. The watermill is 5,000 years away. The windmill is 6,000 years away. For now, there is only the saddle quern, the stone, the grain, and her body. Researchers who have studied the few remaining cultures on Earth that still use saddle querns have measured the labour involved with scientific precision. They have found that grinding grain on a saddle quern requires 4 times more time and twice more muscle activity per kilogram of grain than grinding with a rotary quern. A study cited in the Cambridge research estimated that this task alone could consume approximately 5 hours of manual labour per day, every day, just to produce enough flour for a single family. 5 hours, every day, for years, for decades, for generations, for millennia. And here is the thing that changes everything. The thing that should make you put down whatever you are holding and sit very still for a moment. When Cambridge University archaeologist Alison McIntosh published her landmark study in Science Advances in 2017, comparing the bones of prehistoric women to those of living female athletes for the first time in scientific history, she expected to find strong arms in the prehistoric sample. She knew about the grinding, she knew about the agricultural labour, she was not naive about the physical demands of Neolithic life. She did not expect what she actually found. The Neolithic women in her study, women living 7,400 to 7,000 years ago, women from the earliest farming communities of Central Europe, had arm bones 11 to 16% stronger than the women of the Cambridge University Women's Boat Club. These are athletes who train twice daily. These are athletes who row an average of 120 kilometres per week. These are athletes who had just broken the course record in the annual boat race, the most prestigious rowing competition in the United Kingdom. The prehistoric farm women were stronger, not comparable, not similar, stronger. And these were not elite prehistoric women. These were not warriors or leaders or specialists of any kind. These were ordinary women from ordinary farming villages across what is now Germany, Austria, and the Czech Republic. They were average, the baseline. The study did not stop there. McIntosh examined bones spanning 4 distinct periods: early Neolithic, around 5,300 to 4,600 BC, Bronze Age, around 2,300 to 1,450 BC, Iron Age, around 850 BC to 100 AD, and early medieval, around 800 to 850 AD. For the first 5,500 years of farming, from the earliest Neolithic through the end of the Bronze Age, women's humeral rigidity consistently exceeded that of modern elite athletes, 5,500 years. That is longer than all of recorded history. That is longer than the time between the building of the Great Pyramid and the present moment. For that entire span, women's bodies carried the grinding, hauling, planting, and harvesting, processing, carrying, lifting labour of the agricultural world, and their bones recorded every hour of it. The Bronze Age women were even more extreme. Their arms were 9 to 13% stronger than rowers, but their legs were 12% weaker than the same athletes. This was not a body shaped by balanced exercise. This was a body shaped by labour so concentrated in the upper body, so relentless, so repetitive, so utterly focused on the arms and shoulders and back, that it produced a skeletal profile unlike anything in the modern world. And here is the detail that makes the ground shift beneath the old story, the detail that should have been the headline of every newspaper in the world, but was instead buried in the methods section of an academic paper. The variation was enormous. Not every prehistoric woman showed the same pattern. Some had dramatic bilateral asymmetry, one arm significantly stronger than the other, consistent with habitual one-sided labour like digging with a hoe or carrying heavy loads on one shoulder. Some had leg bones as strong as those of modern long-distance runners, suggesting they walked vast distances, perhaps carrying water or tending distant fields. Some showed patterns consistent with the repetitive motion of hide processing, the scraping and stretching of animal skins. Some showed evidence of compound loading, multiple types of labour stacking on the same skeletal regions. The diversity of the evidence tells us something that the old narrative never could. Women were not doing one job. They were not assigned to a single task within a narrow domestic sphere. They were doing all the jobs: tilling, planting, harvesting, grinding, carrying water, tending livestock, processing milk and meat and hides and fibres, building, repairing, foraging, healing, teaching. And every one of these activities left its signature in their bones, a signature that was there all along waiting to be read. For decades, bioarchaeologists had been studying these same bones and missing the truth. The reason is quietly devastating. They had been comparing women's bones to men's bones, and because male bones respond to mechanical stress in a more visually dramatic way, thicker cortical walls, more pronounced external ridges, more obvious roughening at muscle attachment sites, the women's bones looked, by comparison, unremarkable. So the researchers assumed the women were doing unremarkable work, light domestic tasks, child minding, perhaps some gentle gardening, perhaps some cooking. It was not until McIntosh had the radical idea, radical in 2017, astonishing that it was radical in 2017, of comparing ancient women to modern women of creating a female-specific baseline, of asking what women's bones look like when women are pushed to their physical limits, and then asking whether prehistoric women exceeded those limits, that the truth became undeniable. McIntosh herself said it with the quiet precision of someone who knows the weight of what she has found. By interpreting women's bones in a female-specific context, we can start to see how intensive, variable, and laborious their behaviours were, hinting at a hidden history of women's work over thousands of years. A hidden history, not hidden because the bones were buried, not hidden because the evidence was destroyed, hidden because no one asked the right question, hidden because the entire framework for understanding human physical labour was built on a male baseline, and everything that did not match that baseline was dismissed as lesser, as softer, as smaller, as less important. That hidden history is what we are going to uncover tonight, and it begins not with what early women were allowed to do, or what they were expected to do, or what men decided they should do. It begins with what their bodies prove they actually did, what their bones remember even when their names are lost, what their teeth recorded in layers of mineral and grit, what their hands left behind on cave walls 30,000 years ago pressed against cold limestone in the flickering light of a fat-burning lamp, and he's saying, without words, without writing, without anyone to tell, I was here. I did this. I was real. The story of what early women actually did all day is not a small story. It is not a footnote in the story of civilization. It is not a chapter. It is not a sidebar. It is the story itself, the main narrative, the central thread, the load-bearing wall that everything else rests upon, and it has been waiting, patient and silent in the earth, for 7,000 years. Let us begin. Let us stay with that morning a little longer, because the grinding is only the beginning. The grinding is the overture. The rest of the symphony has not even started. By the time the light has fully risen, pale and watery through the gaps in the timber walls, the colour of diluted milk, she has been working in the dim grey of pre-dawn for an hour or more. The air inside the house has warmed slightly from her exertion. There is a thin sheen of sweat on her forehead, on the insides of her wrists, at the hollow of her throat. Her shoulders burn with a deep, familiar ache. Not sharp, not alarming, but the kind of ache that lives in the muscles permanently, that becomes so ordinary it stops registering as pain and becomes simply the texture of existence. The flour she has produced is coarse by any modern standard. It is gritty and flecked with tiny fragments of stone that have worn off the quern's grinding surface. These stone particles are unavoidable. Every time the upper stone scrapes across the lower, microscopic chips of rock break free and mix into the flour. They are invisible to the eye but devastating to the teeth. This grit will end up in the bread. It will end up between her molars, and over years and decades it will grind down the enamel of her teeth in patterns so distinctive that archaeologists can identify them thousands of years later under a microscope. Her teeth are a diary of her labour, written in mineral. Archaeologists call it dental attrition, the wearing down of tooth surfaces through mechanical contact with abrasive material. In populations that consumed hand-ground grain, the rate of dental attrition is extraordinary. Molars that should last a lifetime are worn flat by middle age. The cusps, the raised points on the biting surface of the teeth, disappear entirely, ground down to smooth planes of exposed dentine. In severe cases, the teeth wear down to the gum line. In extreme cases, the dental wear is so profound that it exposes the pulp cavity, the soft living tissue at the centre of the tooth, leading to infection, abscess, and agonizing pain, in an era with no dentists, no painkillers, and no remedy except the plant-based medicines that the older women knew how to prepare. But the teeth record more than diet. They record work. A study published in the International Journal of Osteoarchaeology examined the teeth of individuals buried at the Neolithic site of Bestansur, in what is now Iraqi Kurdistan, dating to 7,700 to 7,200 BC. The researchers found something extraordinary. 71% of the individuals, men, women and children as young as 5, showed evidence of using their teeth as tools, not for eating, for working. The wear patterns included notches, distinctive V-shaped indentations on the biting edges of the front teeth, caused by repeatedly gripping thin, hard objects. Grooves, narrow linear channels running across the chewing surface, caused by pulling fibrous material between the teeth. And chipping, irregular fractures of the enamel at the tooth margins, caused by biting down on hard materials with excessive force. The clearest example was an adult woman, catalogued as SK1778, aged around 20 to 30 years. This single individual had 24 of her 30 teeth affected by extra masticatory wear, 6 notched teeth, so 2 teeth with occlusal grooves, 14 teeth with enamel chipping. Her mouth was a workshop, her teeth were her tools, and the materials she was processing, identified through the wear patterns and confirmed by associated archaeological finds at the site, were plant fibres, reeds, flax, hemp, sinew, the raw materials of textile production. She was using her teeth as a third hand, holding fibres in her front teeth while both hands pulled and twisted and wove them into cordage, into netting, into the beginnings of cloth. The pierced stone net sinkers found at the same site tell us what she was making. Fishing nets. The fragments of reed matting tell us she was weaving floor coverings. The beads tell us she was threading decorative objects, and she was not alone. At Bestansur, the evidence of teeth as tools was found across both sexes and all age groups. Children as young as 5 showed the same patterns. This was not specialised labour. This was a community where everyone, from the oldest grandmother to the youngest child who could sit upright and grip a strand of reed, participated in the production of the materials that kept the community alive. But the grinding is done for now. She stores the flour in a clay vessel, a vessel that she or another woman in the settlement almost certainly made. Pottery in early agricultural communities was overwhelmingly women's work, shaped by hand from locally sourced clay, coiled and smoothed and dried and fired in open pits or simple kilns. The fingerprints of the makers are sometimes preserved in the clay surface. An analysis of those fingerprints, the ridge patterns, the finger widths, the proportional ratios, frequently indicates female hands. The earliest pottery traditions on Earth bear the marks of the women who made them. Now she eats, though eating is almost too grand a word for what happens. A piece of flatbread from yesterday, dense, heavy, slightly stale, baked on a hot stone beside the hearth fire. The bread is dark and coarse, nothing like the soft white risen loaves of the modern world. It is essentially compressed flour and water, and the stone grit from the grinding process is embedded in every bite. Perhaps she has some dried fruit, small, sour, hard-skinned, nothing like modern cultivated berries. Perhaps a little fermented goat's milk, thick and tangy, stored in a clay pot sealed with a scrap of hide. Perhaps nothing at all, if the stores are low and the next harvest is still weeks away. Hunger in the early agricultural world is not an emergency, it is a season. It comes and goes like weather, and you learn to move through it the way you move through rain, not by stopping, but by continuing. Women's bodies, with their higher percentage of essential body fat, typically 20 to 25% compared to men's 15 to 20, are biologically structured to endure caloric scarcity more efficiently. The fat reserves serve as a metabolic buffer, releasing energy slowly during periods of reduced intake, preserving muscle function and cognitive clarity longer than male physiology typically allows. This is not a weakness. This is an adaptation, an evolutionary advantage shaped by millennia of exactly these conditions. After eating, or not eating, the day opens into labour. And this is where the modern imagination fails completely. We have been conditioned to picture early women's work as domestic, as interior, contained, limited, repetitive in a small and gentle way. The word domestic itself conjures images of enclosure. A woman inside a house, a woman sweeping a floor, a woman watching children play in a yard. The word carries with it an implicit judgment. Domestic means minor. Domestic means secondary. Domestic means the work that did not really matter. The archaeological evidence paints a wildly, almost violently different picture. A Neolithic woman's workday was not contained within the walls of her house. It spanned the entire landscape of her community and sometimes beyond it. Studies of early agricultural settlements across Europe, the Near East and Central Asia reveal that women were central to nearly every productive activity that sustained the group. Not peripheral, not supporting, central. They planted crops, not with ploughs. The plough would not be invented for another 2,000 years, and even then would initially be pulled by humans before oxen were trained for the purpose. Neolithic planting was done by hand, with digging sticks carved from hardwood and hoes made of bone or antler or chipped stone lashed to wooden handles. Planting meant bending over a cleared field for hours, pushing the stick into the earth, dropping a seed, covering it with soil, moving forward, and repeating. It meant doing this across fields large enough to feed a family for a year. It meant doing this while pregnant, while nursing, while carrying a toddler on one hip. They tended fields by hand. Weeding was not a weekend chore. It was an existential necessity. A Neolithic wheat field overrun by weeds would produce a fraction of its potential yield, and that fraction could mean the difference between surviving the winter and not surviving it. Women walked the rows, pulling weeds by hand, turning the soil around the base of each plant to improve drainage, monitoring the health of the crop with the same intense attention that a modern engineer gives to a critical system. They watched for signs of disease, they watched for signs of drought, they watched for signs of pest damage. They knew what each sign meant, and they knew what to do about it, because this knowledge had been passed to them by their mothers, who had received it from their mothers across generations of accumulated observation. They harvested by hand, using flint sickles, small curved blades of knapped stone set into handles of wood or bone. They cut the stalks of grain close to the ground, gathered them into bundles, and carried them back to the settlement on their backs and shoulders. Harvesting was one of the most time-sensitive activities of the year. Grain left too long in the field would shatter and scatter. The kernels lost to the ground and the birds. A few days' delay could cost a significant portion of the crop. So women harvested in the heat, in the rain, from dawn to dusk, bending and cutting and gathering until the light failed, and their hands bled from the rough stalks, and their backs ached from the constant stooping. Between the field and the grinding stone, they processed the harvest through a series of labour-intensive steps that each required specific knowledge and physical effort. Threshing, beating the harvested grain with sticks or trampling it with feet to separate the kernels from the stalks. Winnowing, tossing the threshed grain into the air on a flat basket so that the wind carried away the lighter husks, while the heavier kernels fell back down. Drying, spreading the cleaned grain on flat surfaces in the sun, and turning it regularly, sometimes for days, to prevent the moisture content from causing mould and spoilage during storage. Each step was manual, physical, time-consuming, and absolutely essential. Skip any one of them, and the grain rots. The grain rots, and the family starves. But crops were only part of the picture. Livestock demanded relentless daily attention. In early farming communities that kept cattle, sheep, or goats, the daily care of animals was not a chore that could be postponed or abbreviated. Animals had to be fed, not with commercial feed purchased in bags, but with hand-gathered fodder, grasses, leaves, crop residues, wild plants collected from the surrounding landscape and carried back in bundles. Animals had to be watered, led to the stream or given water carried in heavy clay vessels. Young animals had to be separated from their mothers for milking, and milking itself was a skilled, patience-demanding task that produced only a litre or so of milk per goat per day, all of which had to be processed immediately. Because there was no refrigeration. There was no cold storage. There was no way to keep raw milk from spoiling within hours in warm weather. So women developed the technologies of dairy processing, not in laboratories, not with instruments, but through generations of empirical observation and trial and error. They learned which vessels promoted beneficial fermentation and which caused dangerous spoilage. They learned how temperature affected the curdling process. They learned how to separate curds from whey, how to press fresh cheese, how to culture yogurt, how to store fermented milk products in conditions that preserved them for weeks or months. This was chemistry, real chemistry. The fact that it was performed by women in mud brick houses rather than by men in universities does not make it less sophisticated. It makes it more impressive, because these women achieved reliable, reproducible results without any of the tools that we consider essential to scientific practice. And then there was water, the invisible labour that underlies everything. Water did not arrive through pipes. It did not emerge from taps. It had to be carried, from the nearest stream or spring or well, in vessels made of fired clay or animal hide, or woven reed sealed with pitch, balanced on heads or hips or shoulders or carried in both hands. Every drop of water used for drinking, cooking, cleaning, bathing, watering livestock, soaking hides, mixing clay for pottery, dampening grain for grinding. Every single drop was carried by a human body from the water source to the point of use and back again. Archaeological and ethnographic studies of water carrying in traditional agricultural societies estimate that women in these communities spent between 1 and 3 hours per day on water transport alone. The distances varied from a few hundred metres in settlements located near rivers to a kilometre or more in drier environments, or during seasons when the nearest water source retreated. The loads were heavy. A full clay water vessel could weigh 10 to 15 kilograms, and a woman might make the trip multiple times in a single day. The physical toll was written in the skeleton. Women from agricultural periods often show asymmetric bone development, one arm or one leg noticeably stronger than the other, consistent with habitual carrying of heavy loads on one side of the body. The spine shows evidence of compression, the vertebrae pressed closer together by years of bearing weight on the head or shoulders. The hips show wear patterns from the constant rotation of walking under load. By midday, the woman who began her morning grinding grain in the dark has already performed more physical labour than most modern adults perform in a week. Her body has been in continuous motion, lifting, carrying, bending, pressing, walking, kneeling, pulling, for 6 or 7 hours without a break that we would recognise as rest. And her day is barely half over. The afternoon might bring textile work, the spinning of plant fibres or animal wool into thread using a drop spindle, a process that requires the coordination of both hands in a continuous rhythmic motion while walking or sitting. The weaving of that thread into cloth on a simple vertical loom, a process that required standing for hours, reaching up and down to pass the shuttle, beating the weft into place with a heavy wooden beater. It might bring hide processing, the scraping of animal skins with stone or bone tools to remove fat and tissue, the stretching of the cleaned hide on a frame, the softening process that could involve chewing the leather with the teeth or working it with the hands for hours until it became supple enough to cut and sew. It might bring pottery making, the gathering and preparing of clay, the shaping of vessels by hand, the careful drying process, the firing that required constant attention to temperature and airflow for hours. It might bring foraging, the gathering of wild plants, roots, nuts, berries, mushrooms and herbs to supplement the cultivated diet. Foraging was not a casual stroll through the woods. It required encyclopedic knowledge of the local ecology, which plants were edible, which were medicinal, which were poisonous, where they grew, when they ripened, how they should be prepared. This knowledge was vast, specific and critical. A mistake, eating the wrong root, feeding the wrong berry to a child, could be fatal. It might bring childcare, but not the modern version of childcare where one adult sits in a climate-controlled room supervising children who play with manufactured toys. Neolithic childcare happened in motion. Children were carried while women worked, infants strapped to the body in slings made of hide or woven fabric, riding on the hip while their mother ground grain, nursed while she wove, balanced on the back while she walked to the stream. Children were not separate from labour. Children were part of the labour, so they were participants in it from an astonishingly young age. A 4-year-old could sort grain. A 6-year-old could gather kindling. An 8-year-old could tend the fire that heated the pottery kiln. A 10-year-old could grind grain alongside her mother, developing the calluses and the muscle memory and the bone strength that would define the rest of her life. This was alloparenting, cooperative childcare, and it was not a modern invention. It was one of the oldest human strategies, and it was overwhelmingly managed by women. Grandmothers, aunts, older sisters, female neighbours, a web of female cooperation that allowed individual mothers to maintain their productive labour, while ensuring that children were safe, fed, taught, and watched. And through all of it, woven into every task like the warp thread of a textile, there was the knowledge. The pharmacological knowledge of which plants healed wounds and which caused vomiting, and which eased the pain of childbirth, and which could end a pregnancy if the timing was wrong, or the body was too depleted, or the family could not sustain another child. The agricultural knowledge of when to plant and when to harvest, how to read the soil and the sky, which fields to rest and which to cultivate, how to rotate crops to preserve the land's fertility. The material knowledge of which clay made the strongest pots, and which fibres spun the most durable thread, and how hot a fire needed to be to transform raw grain into bread, raw clay into ceramic, raw hide into supple leather. This knowledge was not written down. It could not be written down. Writing would not exist for another 4,000 years. It was carried in living memory, or in the bodies and minds of women, transmitted through demonstration, through repetition, through the daily practice of living, daughter watching mother, granddaughter watching grandmother, generation after generation, the knowledge flowing like an underground river, invisible, indispensable, and older than any monument. It was this knowledge, not kings, not armies, not conquest, not any of the events that fill the chapters of traditional history books, that made civilization possible. The quiet, daily, unglamorous, physically devastating, intellectually demanding knowledge of how to keep a family alive, how to keep a community alive, how to turn raw earth into food and raw fibre into cloth and raw pain into something survivable. When the light fades and the woman finally stops, when the last task is done and the children are settled and the fire is banked for the night, and the grinding stone sits silent in the corner, waiting for tomorrow, her body carries the record of everything she has done. Her bones are reshaping themselves around her labour, growing denser in the places where stress is greatest, remodelling their internal architecture to accommodate the forces she applies to them every day. Her teeth are wearing down from the grit in the bread and from the fibres she has gripped between them. Her muscles ache with the deep fatigue that comes from using every part of your body for something that matters. She lies down on a reed mat, perhaps with a hide for warmth, perhaps with a child's body pressed against hers. The fire glows. The settlement goes quiet. The stars turn overhead, the same stars that have turned above every woman who has ever lived, and that will turn above every woman who ever will. She does not know that 7,000 years from now, someone will study her skeleton and finally understand what she did. She does not know that for most of those 7,000 years, the people studying the past will assume she did almost nothing, that she was a footnote, a background figure, a supporting character in a story about men. She only knows that tomorrow the grain will need grinding again, and she will be there, in the dark before dawn, kneeling at the stone, as she always is. There is a particular kind of injustice that happens when the evidence exists, when it has always existed, but no one reads it correctly. When the truth is sitting in a museum drawer, labelled and catalogued and available to any researcher who asks to see it, and yet the truth remains invisible because the people looking at it do not have the framework to understand what they are seeing. This is what happened to the bones of prehistoric women for more than a century. Physical anthropology, the study of human skeletal remains, has been a scientific discipline since the mid-1800s. For over 150 years, researchers have excavated, measured, photographed and analysed the bones of ancient people. They have developed increasingly sophisticated methods for extracting information from skeletal tissue, determining age at death, sex, nutritional status, disease history, geographic origin, and habitual physical activity. The technology has improved dramatically over time, from simple calipers to X-ray to CT scanning to ancient DNA analysis. And yet, throughout this entire period, a fundamental error persisted in the way female skeletons were interpreted. The error was not in the measurement. The measurements were accurate. The error was in the comparison. When researchers wanted to understand what activities had shaped the bones of ancient people, they used a comparative method. Take a skeleton, measure the cross-sectional geometry of the long bones, the thickness of the cortical wall, the distribution of bone tissue around the shaft, the overall rigidity and bending strength of the bone. Compare these measurements to a reference group whose activities are known. Draw conclusions about what the ancient individual was doing. For male skeletons, this approach worked reasonably well. Male bones respond to mechanical stress with pronounced external changes. When a man performs heavy, repetitive physical labour, the bones of his arms and legs develop thicker cortical walls, more pronounced ridges at the points where muscles and tendons attach, and a characteristic cross-sectional shape that reflects the direction and intensity of the forces applied to them. These changes are visible, measurable, and interpretable. Female bones respond to the same mechanical stresses, but they respond differently. Here, the key factor is estrogen. Estrogen, which, as we will discover later in this story, is one of the most remarkable hormones in human biology, moderates the way female bones remodel under stress. In male bones, mechanical loading triggers a process called periosteal apposition, the addition of new bone tissue to the outer surface of the bone, making it visibly thicker and more robust. In female bones, Estrogen inhibits this outer remodeling and redirects the response inward. Bone tissue is added to the inner surface of the bone shaft, endosteal apposition, and the internal architecture is reorganized to increase strength without dramatically changing the external dimensions. The result is that a woman performing the same physical labor as a man will develop bones that are internally stronger but externally less impressive. The bones look smaller, they look lighter, they look, to a researcher using a male baseline, like the bones of someone who is not doing much, and this is exactly what happened. For decade after decade, researchers measured female bones, compared them to male bones, noted that the female bones showed less external remodeling, and concluded, with no awareness that their framework was flawed, that the women had led less physically demanding lives. Light domestic work, childcare, some gardening perhaps, nothing to write home about. The systematic nature of this error cannot be overstated. This was not one researcher making one mistake. This was an entire field operating under a shared assumption that no one questioned because it aligned perfectly with the cultural beliefs of the societies that produced the researchers. Of course, women did less physical work than men, everyone knew that. The bones confirmed it. The science was settled, except it was not science. It was bias wearing the costume of science, and the costume was so convincing that it fooled the entire discipline for over 100 years. The correction arrived in 2017, and it arrived from Cambridge. Alison McIntosh was a postdoctoral researcher in the Department of Archaeology at the University of Cambridge, working on the European Research Council-funded ADAPT project, Adaptation, Dispersals and Phenotype, headed by Dr. J. Stock. Her task was straightforward in concept and revolutionary in execution. Compare the bones of prehistoric women not to men but to living women whose physical activities were known and documented. To do this, she needed modern female athletes. Yes, she needed women who pushed their bodies to documented limits, women whose bone-loading regimes were measurable, repeatable, and intense enough to serve as a meaningful comparison group. She found them on the river. During trial season for the annual boat race, the historic rowing competition between Oxford and Cambridge, McIntosh used a small CT scanner in Cambridge's PAVE laboratory to scan the arm and leg bones of the open and lightweight squads of the Cambridge University Women's Boat Club. These women, most in their early 20s, were training twice a day, mornings on the river and afternoons in the gym, and rowing an average of 120 kilometres per week. They were, by any objective standard, among the most physically active women on Earth. Their bones were shaped by extreme, sustained, undocumented physical exertion. McIntosh also scanned the bones of female runners, football players, and sedentary university students, creating a full spectrum of modern female bone loading from the most intense to the least active. Then she turned to the ancient bones. Her prehistoric sample came from Central European agricultural communities, women buried in cemeteries dating from the early Neolithic through the medieval period. She CT scanned their humeri, upper arm bones, and tibiae, shin bones, measured the cross-sectional geometric properties, the same properties she had measured in the living athletes, and compared them. The numbers were unambiguous. Neolithic women, the earliest farmers, had leg bone strength roughly comparable to modern sedentary women. Their legs were not exceptional. This suggested that while these women walked and carried loads, the intensity of their lower body activity was not dramatically different from that of a modern person with a moderately active lifestyle. But their arms told a different story entirely. Neolithic women's humeral rigidity, the measure of how resistant the arm bone is to bending and twisting, was 11 to 16% greater than that of the Cambridge rowers. Not greater than sedentary women, greater than elite athletes, women who trained twice a day, women who had just broken the course record, women who represent the absolute upper end of modern female upper body loading. The prehistoric women exceeded them, significantly, consistently, across multiple measurements. The Bronze Age women showed an even more pronounced pattern. Their arm bones were 9 to 13% stronger than the rowers, but their leg bones were 12% weaker. The skeletal profile was one of extreme upper body dominance, a body shaped by labour so concentrated in the arms, shoulders, and back that the lower body had actually become relatively graceful by comparison. Iron Age women showed the beginning of a decline. Their arm strength was approaching the range of modern athletes rather than exceeding it, and medieval women had decreased further, their arm bones converging toward the levels of modern sedentary women. The timeline tells a story of technological change more powerfully than any textbook. The saddle quern, the ancient grinding stone that demanded 5 hours of daily upper body labour, was gradually replaced by the rotary quern in the Iron Age. The rotary quern required 4 times less time and half the muscle activity per kilogram of grain. As the technology improved, the physical cost to women's bodies decreased. The medieval period brought further improvements: watermills, windmills, horse-driven mills that progressively removed the burden of grain grinding from the human body. But for 5,500 years, from the earliest Neolithic to the end of the Bronze Age, that burden had been borne by women, and their bones carried the receipt. Mackintosh was careful in her conclusions, but her co-author J. Stock was more direct. Our findings suggest that for thousands of years, the rigorous manual labour of women was a crucial driver of early farming economies. A crucial driver, not a support system, not a secondary contribution, the engine. The study's impact on the field was seismic, though you might not have noticed, because seismic shifts in archaeology tend to happen in journal articles rather than on front pages. What Mackintosh had demonstrated was not just a correction of specific data points. It was a demonstration that the entire interpretive framework for understanding women's physical activity in the past had been wrong, fundamentally, structurally, comprehensively wrong, because it was built on a male baseline that made female achievement invisible by definition. When you measure everyone against a male standard, women will always appear to fall short, not because they do, but because the ruler is wrong. The bones were always there. They were always telling the truth. The arm bones of 7,000-year-old farm women were always stronger than those of modern Olympic rowers. That fact existed in the physical world, in the mineral density and cortical thickness and cross-sectional geometry of real bones in real graves and for millennia. We just were not ready to hear it, because hearing it would have meant questioning everything we thought we knew about who did the work that built the world. Deep inside a cave in northern Spain, in a chamber so far from the entrance that no natural light has reached it in 30,000 years, there is a wall covered in hand stencils. To reach them, you must walk, sometimes crawl, through narrow passages of cold limestone. The air is damp and heavy. The temperature holds at a constant 12 or 13 degrees Celsius regardless of the season. The silence is absolute. No wind, no bird song, no rushing water. Nothing but your own breathing, the drip of mineral-laden water from the ceiling, and the sound of your own heartbeat in your ears. This is the world of Paleolithic cave art. And for as long as modern humans have been studying it, since the discovery of Altamira in 1879, since the astonishing revelations of Lascaux in 1940, since the ancient splendours of Chauvet emerged in 1994, we have assumed we knew who made it. Men, obviously men, hunters, male shamans, male artists. The logic seemed airtight. The caves contained paintings of bison, horses, aurochs, reindeer, mammoths, the great game animals of the Pleistocene, the animals that dominated the landscape and the imagination of Ice Age Europe. Since hunting was assumed to be exclusively men's work, the art that depicted hunted animals was assumed to be men's art. The hand stencils that accompanied these paintings were assumed to be men's hands. Every museum label, every documentary narration, every textbook caption reinforced the assumption. This was man's art. It was a closed loop. Men hunted. The art showed hunted animals, therefore men made the art. The conclusion was embedded in the premise. Nobody tested it, until Dean Snow decided to look at the fingers. Snow was an archaeologist at Pennsylvania State University, and in the early 2000s he came across the research of John Manning, a British biologist who had identified a reliable pattern of sexual dimorphism in human hands. The discovery was straightforward. Men and women differ in the relative lengths of their fingers. Women tend to have ring and index fingers of roughly equal length. The ratio between them is close to 1. Men's ring fingers tend to be noticeably longer than their index fingers. The ratio is typically greater than 1. This ratio, called the 2D to 4D ratio for second digit to fourth digit, is set before birth, influenced by prenatal hormone exposure, and is consistent enough across populations to be used as a sex indicator. Not perfectly. There is overlap between the sexes, and individual variation is considerable. But as a statistical tool applied to large samples, it works. Snow saw the potential immediately. If the finger-length ratio differed between men and women, and if that ratio could be measured from hand stencils on cave walls, then it might be possible to determine the sex of the people who had made those stencils tens of thousands of years ago. He spent years developing an algorithm. He calibrated it against a modern reference population, people of European descent living near his university, whose sex was known. The algorithm used multiple measurements: the length of the fingers, the length of the hand, the ratio of ring finger to index finger, the ratio of index finger to little finger, the width of the palm. When applied to his modern sample, the algorithm predicted sex with approximately 60% accuracy, a modest figure reflecting the substantial overlap between male and female hand dimensions in living people. But when he turned the algorithm on the Paleolithic hand stencils, something unexpected happened. The ancient hands were dramatically more sexually dimorphic than modern hands. The differences between male and female measurements were far more pronounced, falling at the extreme ends of the modern range, and sometimes beyond it. 20,000 years ago, men were men and women were women, Snow observed. The overlap that muddied the analysis of modern hands barely existed in the Paleolithic sample. Snow analysed 32 hand stencils from 8 cave sites in France and Spain, including El Castillo, one of the oldest decorated caves in Europe, and Pechmerle, home to the famous spotted horse panel. Of those 32 stencils, his algorithm identified 24, 75%, as female. 3/4 of the oldest known hand stencils in human history were made by women. The study was published in 2013 in the journal American Antiquity, and it dropped into a field that was still predominantly male, still operating under the man-the-hunter framework, and still reflexively attributing all prehistoric achievement to men. The response was mixed. Some researchers were skeptical. Evolutionary biologist Ardale Guthrie had performed a similar but differently designed analysis years earlier and concluded that most handprints belonged to adolescent boys. Others were enthusiastic. Archaeologist Dave Whitley called Snow's paper a landmark contribution. Snow himself was characteristically understated about the implications. "There has been a male bias in the literature for a long time," he said. "People have made a lot of unwarranted assumptions about who made these things and why. But the implications are anything but small. If women made the hand stencils, the question immediately arises, did they also make the paintings? Were the great animal murals of Lascaux and Altamira and Chauvet, the images that have defined our understanding of human cognitive evolution, that appear in every survey course on art history, that have been called the Sistine Chapel of prehistory, were they created by female hands? We cannot know for certain. Hand stencils and animal paintings are different categories of cave art, and the people who made one may not be the same people who made the other. But the assumption that they were both made by men rested on exactly the same unsupported logic. The assumption that significant cultural achievement in prehistory was a male domain. Snow's research demolished half of that assumption. The other half is, at minimum, deeply vulnerable, and then there is Cap Blanc. The Cap Blanc rock shelter lies in the Dordogne region of southwestern France, one of the richest areas for Paleolithic art in the world. During the Magdalenian period, roughly 15,000 years ago, someone carved a monumental sculpted frieze into the limestone wall of this shelter. 6 horses, several bison, 1 or 2 deer heads. The carving is not a sketch. It is a full-scale, 3-dimensional, deeply worked sculpture in stone, one of the masterpieces of Upper Paleolithic art. In 1911, workers excavating the shelter floor discovered a human skeleton buried directly beneath the central horse of the frieze. The skeleton was assumed, naturally, inevitably, without question, to be male, the great artist buried beneath his masterpiece. Later, more detailed osteological analysis revealed the truth. The skeleton was female, a woman, probably aged between 25 and 35 at the time of her death, and the physical anthropologist who examined the remains noticed a distinctive pattern in the bone development of her upper body. She had significantly greater muscular development on the left side. She was left-handed. The tool marks on the sculpted frieze, the chisel strikes, the scraping patterns, the directional signatures left by the instruments that carved horses and bison from raw limestone, are consistent with a left-handed carver. We cannot prove with certainty that this woman carved the Cap Blanc frieze. The evidence is circumstantial, but it is provocative. A left-handed woman buried beneath a frieze carved by a left-handed artist, in a world where the hand stencils in nearby caves were 75% female, in a culture where women's involvement in art was far more extensive than anyone assumed. Now consider the Venus figurines, the small carved sculptures of female bodies that represent the oldest three-dimensional art in human history. The Venus of Hohlefels, found in a cave in southwestern Germany, is carved from mammoth ivory and dates to approximately 40,000 years ago, while it is the oldest known figurative sculpture ever found. She has no head, or rather the head was replaced by a polished ring, suggesting the figurine was meant to be worn as a pendant. Her breasts are large, her belly is round, her vulva is carved with careful, deliberate detail. For decades, these figurines were interpreted through a male gaze. They were fertility figures, objects of male worship or male desire or male ritual. The assumption was always that they were made by men, about women. But a provocative alternative interpretation has gained traction. What if these figurines were made by women about themselves? What if they are not objects of worship, but objects of knowledge? Self-portraits, teaching tools, records of the female body during pregnancy, mnemonic devices for midwifery knowledge? Now, one researcher has even proposed that the distinctive proportions of the Venus figurines, the large breasts, the swollen belly, the de-emphasized head and feet, are consistent with the perspective of a woman looking down at her own body. A self-portrait from first-person perspective. We do not know. The figurines remain one of the great interpretive puzzles of prehistory, but the frame has shifted. The automatic assumption that significant art was made by and for men no longer holds. The hand stencils broke it. The Cat Blanc skeleton complicated it. The sheer volume and persistence of female imagery across 40,000 years of Paleolithic art demands that we consider the possibility that women were not just the subjects of this art, but its creators. And there is something else about those hand stencils. Something that goes beyond academic debate and touches the raw nerve of human identity. Picture her, a woman in the Paleolithic, tens of thousands of years ago. She has walked, perhaps crawled, deep into a cave, far from the light, carrying a small lamp fueled by animal fat, its flame throwing wild, jumping shadows across the undulating walls of stone. She carries a mouthful of red ochre pigment, iron oxide ground to a fine powder and mixed with water or saliva or animal fat into a thin paste. She reaches a wall. She holds the lamp close, and the stone seems to breathe in the light. Golden, rippled, ancient. She raises her free hand and presses it flat against the cold rock. The stone is wet, beaded with condensation, and her skin adheres slightly. She can feel the texture of the limestone through her fingertips, rough, granular, alive with the microgeography of geological time. Then she blows. She purses her lips and blows a mist of pigment across the back of her hand and through the spaces between her spread fingers. The ochre settles on the wall in a haze of red. Red like blood, red like sunset, red like the clay banks of the river where she gathered this pigment days or weeks ago. She pulls her hand away, and there, on the wall, outlined in red, is the negative image of her hand. 5 fingers, a palm, a presence. In a world without writing, without names carved in stone, without any permanent medium for personal identity except the stone itself, she has found a way to say something that still resonates across the millennia. I was here. I was real. I did this. This is mine. 20,000 years later, 30,000 years later, her hand is still there. Still pressed against the cold wall in the permanent darkness of a cave that she will never see again. Still speaking in a voice that has no words but needs none. And for most of those thousands of years, we looked at her hand and thought it belonged to a man. In 1966, at the University of Chicago, 2 anthropologists named Richard Lee and Irvin DeVore organized a conference that would shape the study of human evolution for the next half-century. They called it Man the Hunter. The conference brought together leading anthropologists, archaeologists, and evolutionary biologists to discuss a single ambitious idea, that hunting was the defining activity of human evolution, that the transition from ape to human was driven by the demands of the hunt, the need for bipedalism, for tool use, for social cooperation, for strategic thinking, for language, and that this activity, this engine of human progress, was performed exclusively by men. Women, in this framework, gathered plants. They stayed near the camp. They tended children. They were important in their way, certainly. But they were not the protagonists of human evolution. The protagonists were the men with the spears, The resulting book, published in 1968, became one of the most influential texts in anthropology. Man the Hunter was not just a title. It became a paradigm, a lens through which an entire generation of scientists interpreted the human past. It shaped museum exhibits, it shaped documentary films, it shaped the illustrations in every textbook from grade school to graduate school. The image of the prehistoric man striding across the savannah with a spear, while the prehistoric woman waited at camp with a basket, became so ubiquitous that it stopped being an interpretation and became a fact. An obvious, unquestionable, natural fact. And for over 50 years, virtually no one challenged it. The challenge, when it finally came, did not arrive as a single thunderbolt. It accumulated, slowly, painfully, against enormous institutional resistance, through decades of accumulating evidence that the old story could not contain. The first cracks appeared in the ethnographic record. The Acta people of the Philippines, a foraging society that has been studied by anthropologists since the 1970s, provided one of the most vivid counterexamples to the man-the-hunter model. Among the Acta, women hunt, not occasionally, not symbolically. They carry spears. They track wild pigs and deer through dense tropical forest. They make kills, and they do it while carrying infants, strapped in slings across their bodies, nursed between bouts of pursuit, present for the entire hunt from tracking to butchery. Byron Griffin published his landmark study, Woman the Hunter, the Acta, in 1981. It described women who hunted in groups and individually, who used knives and dogs and nets and spears, whose hunting contributed significantly to the community's protein intake. The Acta women did not ask permission to hunt. They did not treat hunting as a special occasion. They hunted the way they did everything else, as a normal, necessary, valued part of daily life. But the Acta were dismissed as an anomaly, an exception, a peculiar culture that did not represent the norm. So researchers looked further, and the further they looked, the more the anomaly started to look like the pattern. In 2020, a team led by Randall Hess of the University of California, Davis, excavated a 9,000-year-old burial at the Andean highland site of Willamayapacha in Peru. The burial contained the skeleton of a young woman, approximately 18 years old at death, alongside a hunting toolkit, stone projectile points, and animal processing equipment. The type of grave goods that had always, in every previous analysis, been coded as male. Haas's team did not treat this discovery as an isolated curiosity. They did what no one had done before. They systematically re-examined every known burial from the late Pleistocene and early Holocene in the Americas where hunting tools accompanied human remains. They applied rigorous osteological and, where possible, genetic methods to determine the sex of each skeleton. Of 27 such burials, the analysis suggested that females may have represented up to 50% of the individuals buried with big game hunting tools. Half, not 1%. Not 5%. Not a statistically insignificant margin. 50%. Half of the people buried as hunters in the prehistoric Americas were women. In 2023, the evidence cascaded. A sweeping cross-cultural study published in PLOS ONE examined ethnographic data from 63 foraging societies around the world, spread across every inhabited continent, representing a vast diversity of environments, technologies, and cultural traditions. Of the 50 societies where documentation about women's activities existed, 79%, 40 out of 50, had evidence of women hunting. Of those, 87% described women's hunting as intentional, not opportunistic, not accidental, deliberate, planned, purposeful. Women hunted in the Philippines, in Australia, in Africa, in South America, in the Arctic. They hunted with nets and spears and bows and dogs and fire. They hunted alone and in groups. They hunted large game and small game. They hunted while pregnant and while nursing. They hunted in many societies as a matter of course, as naturally and as frequently as they gathered plants. The evidence was not new. Much of it had been sitting in ethnographic archives for decades, but it had been systematically underweighted, dismissed or reinterpreted to fit the man-the-hunter paradigm. A woman buried with hunting tools. The tools must have been placed there for symbolic reasons. A woman in an ethnographic report described as hunting. She must have been an exception. The paradigm was so powerful that it functioned as a filter. Any evidence that contradicted it was automatically discounted. while any evidence that supported it was automatically amplified. This is not how science is supposed to work, but it is often how science does work, especially when the theory being protected aligns with the cultural assumptions of the scientists doing the protecting. And then Kara Okobock and Sarah Lacey published their twin studies in American Anthropologist, and the man-the-hunter model did not just crack, it shattered. Okobock, a human biologist at the University of Notre Dame, and Lacey, a biological archaeologist at the University of Delaware, attacked the problem from two angles simultaneously. Lacey assembled the archaeological evidence, the burials, the injury patterns, the tool associations. Okobock dissected the physiology. Her physiological analysis was devastating. Not devastating to the idea that men could hunt. Of course they could. Devastating to the idea that female biology was a barrier to hunting. Because the evidence showed the opposite. Female biology was, in specific and measurable ways, an advantage. The key was endurance. The dominant hunting strategy of the Paleolithic world was not the quick ambush. It was persistence hunting, the pursuit of prey over long distances, often for hours, until the animal collapsed from exhaustion and heat stress, at which point the hunter moved in for the kill. This strategy does not favour raw strength. It does not favour explosive power. It favours the ability to sustain aerobic effort over extended periods while managing heat, conserving energy, and maintaining cognitive function during prolonged physical stress. In every one of these categories, the female body has a measurable advantage. The mechanism is hormonal. Estrogen, the hormone that modern culture has associated with softness, with curves, with everything supposedly opposite to the hard physicality of the hunt, is, in biological reality, a metabolic regulator of extraordinary sophistication. Estrogen promotes the preferential use of stored body fat as fuel during sustained aerobic exercise. Fat is a denser energy source than carbohydrate, 9 calories per gram compared to 4. When the body burns fat before it burns carbohydrate, the result is a longer, slower, more sustainable energy release. The glycogen stores in the muscles and liver, the body's carbohydrate reserves, are preserved for later, when they might be critical for a final burst of speed or a moment of crisis. In practical terms, this means the female body can sustain moderate to high physical effort for longer before hitting the wall of exhaustion. Estrogen also protects cells from oxidative damage during prolonged exertion. It supports cardiovascular function by maintaining the flexibility of blood vessels. It aids in post-exercise recovery. It reduces the risk of muscle damage during sustained effort. Adiponectin, a second hormone present in higher concentrations in female bodies, amplifies the effect. Adiponectin enhances fat metabolism while sparing muscle protein, effectively protecting the muscles from breaking down during extended activity. The result is that after a long pursuit, a female hunter's muscles would be in better condition, less damaged, less depleted, yet more functional, than a male hunter's muscles subjected to the same duration and intensity of effort. And then there is the pelvis. The wider hip structure of the female body, so often cited as evidence of women's supposed physical limitation, is actually an advantage in locomotion. Wider hips allow for greater rotation during the walking and running stride, which increases step length. Each longer step covers more ground with less energy expenditure. Over hours and miles, this adds up to a significant metabolic advantage. A female runner covering the same distance as a male runner of equivalent fitness would burn fewer calories. Okobock summarized it with characteristic clarity. When you look at human physiology this way, you can think of women as the marathon runners versus men as the power lifters. And persistence hunting, the defining strategy of early human subsistence, is the ultimate marathon. The fossil record confirms what the physiology predicts. Neanderthal and early Homo sapiens skeletons show identical patterns and rates of traumatic injury in males and females. The injuries are distinctive: head wounds, chest trauma, fractured limbs, and they are consistent with the close contact, dangerous style of hunting that characterized the Paleolithic. Hunters of large game animals got kicked, charged, trampled, and gored. They broke bones and cracked skulls and compressed vertebrae. And these injuries appear with equal frequency in female and male skeletons. If women were not hunting, they would not have the same injury profiles as the men who were. The injuries are the smoking gun. They are physical proof, written in healed fractures and compressed vertebrae and remodeled bone, that women were in the thick of it, up close to the animals, taking the same risks, absorbing the same impacts. We find these patterns and rates of wear and tear equally in both women and men, Okobock said, so they were both participating in ambush-style hunting of large game animals, and there is the evidence of burial. You don't often get buried with something unless it was important to you, or was something that you used frequently in your life, she said, of the women interred with hunting tools. The bottom line, the simple, clean, and evidence-based conclusion that half a century of anthropological bias had obscured was stated by Okobock with the precision it deserved. Hunting belonged to everyone, not just to males, especially in prehistoric societies where survival was an all-hands-on-deck activity. There weren't enough people living in groups to be specialised in different tasks. Everyone had to be a generalist to survive. And then, the line that reframes not just the research but the entire history of how we study the human past. Rather than viewing it as a way of erasing or rewriting history, our studies are trying to correct the history that erased women from it. That line deserves to be carved in stone, over the entrance to every museum of natural history on Earth. Imagine a city without streets, not a small city, not a cluster of huts, a city, one of the largest and earliest concentrations of human beings anywhere on the planet. 8,000 people at its peak, perhaps more, packed into a settlement that covered 32.5 acres of the Konya Plain in what is now south-central Turkey. The houses were rectangular, built of mud brick, plastered and replastered in smooth, pale clay. They were packed so tightly together, wall against wall, roof against roof, that there were no alleys between them, no lanes, no pathways, no ground-level doors. You entered your home through a hole in the roof. You climbed down a wooden ladder into your living space, and when you needed to go somewhere, to visit a neighbour, to reach the communal midden, or to walk to the fields, you climbed back up the ladder and walked across the rooftops of the city. The roof was the street. The interior was the world. This was Çatalhöyük. It was built around 7,100 BC, and it was occupied continuously for nearly 1,000 years. Roughly 40 human generations lived, worked, loved, grieved, and died within these walls before the settlement was finally abandoned around 5,700 BC. It is one of the most important archaeological sites on Earth, and it has been excavated, analysed, debated and reinterpreted for over 60 years. When the British archaeologist James Mellart first dug at Çatalhöyük in the early 1960s, he was struck by two features of the site. The first was the extraordinary art. Vivid murals painted on the interior walls of the houses depicting hunting scenes, of vultures descending on headless human bodies, geometric patterns in red and black, and what appeared to be an erupting volcano, possibly Hassan Dar, visible from the site. The second was the figurines, dozens of them, hundreds eventually. Small sculptures of human forms, and the overwhelming majority were female, women with full breasts and swelling bellies, women seated on thrones flanked by leopards or lions, women in the act of giving birth, women with their arms raised, their legs spread, their bodies presented in attitudes of power and authority that Mellart had never seen in Neolithic art. He interpreted them as evidence of a mother-goddess cult. He proposed that Çatalhöyük was organised as a matriarchal society, a community where women held the primary positions of religious and social authority, and where the mother-goddess was the central figure of worship, and where the female principle was the organising force of daily life. The archaeological establishment recoiled. Mellart's interpretation was attacked as romantic, unscientific wish-fulfillment masquerading as archaeology. The criticism had some merit. Mellart's methods were not always rigorous by modern standards, and his interpretation rested heavily on the figurines without sufficient attention to other categories of evidence. But the ferocity of the backlash went beyond scholarly disagreement. It reflected a deep discomfort with the idea that any complex society could have been organised around female authority. In the 1990s, Stanford archaeologist Ian Hodder took over excavations at Çatalhöyük with a massive, multidisciplinary team and a commitment to rigorous methodology. His findings were widely interpreted as a correction to Mellart. Hodder found no significant differences between males and females in diet, as revealed by isotopic analysis of bones, in health status or in burial treatment. He concluded that the society was fundamentally egalitarian, no gender hierarchy in either direction. The matriarchy theory was shelved. The figurines were reinterpreted as ritual objects with no clear gendered political significance. The debate seemed settled. For 20 years the consensus held, Çatalhöyük was egalitarian, neither patriarchal nor matriarchal, case closed. Then, in 2025, the DNA spoke. A team of researchers led by Mehmet Sumel, an evolutionary geneticist at Middle East Technical University in Turkey, conducted the most comprehensive ancient DNA study ever performed on a Neolithic community. They extracted and analysed the DNA of 131 individuals, men, women and children, buried beneath the floors of 35 houses at Çatalhöyük. The burial spanned the full occupation of the site, from 7,100 to 5,800 BC. Burial beneath the house floor was the standard practice at Çatalhöyük. It was not a punishment, not a disposal method, not a convenience. It was an act of profound inclusion. The dead became part of the household, part of the foundation, literally embedded in the ground that the living walked upon every day. House floors were replastered regularly, covering the burials in fresh layers of clay. The dead were beneath the feet of their descendants, invisible but present, remembered and maintained. The DNA analysis allowed Sumel's team to reconstruct the biological relationships among the buried individuals, who was parent and child, who was sibling, who was uncle or aunt or cousin. They connected 109 people across 31 buildings into a web of kinship that revealed the social architecture of the community with a clarity that no previous method had achieved. And the pattern was unmistakable. The intergenerational connections among house burials were organised primarily through maternal lineages. When a household persisted across generations, when a house was occupied, maintained, replastered, and used for burial by successive generations of the same family, it was the women who stayed. Mothers and daughters were buried in the same house. Grandmothers and granddaughters shared the same floor. The female line was the thread that connected one generation to the next within a single dwelling. Men, by contrast, appeared to move. Adult males buried in a house were often not genetically related to the previous generation of that house, through the male line. They had come from elsewhere, from other houses, perhaps from other parts of the settlement. They had married in. We estimated that 70 to 100% of the time, female offspring remained connected to buildings, the researchers wrote, whereas adult male offspring may have moved away. Sommel told Live Science, "We weren't particularly looking for these maternal connections within buildings, but it clearly shows that male-centered practices people have often documented in Neolithic and Bronze Age Europe were not universal." The evidence went deeper. Your ancient DNA can determine the biological sex of infants and young children, something that skeletal analysis alone cannot do reliably until after puberty, when sexual dimorphism in the skeleton becomes pronounced. Before this study, the sex of infant burials at Çatalhöyük was unknown. Now, with genetic sex determination, the researchers could identify which babies were girls and which were boys, and they found a pattern that had been hiding in the archaeological record for 60 years, invisible until the technology existed to reveal it. Female babies were buried with more grave goods than male babies. In a society where burial beneath the house floor was the ultimate act of inclusion, the dead literally becoming part of the physical and spiritual foundation of the household. The infants who received the richest burials, the most elaborate treatment, the greatest material investment, were girls. Girls were not incidental to this society. Girls were its future. The society was organised around the expectation that daughters would carry the lineage forward, that daughters would inherit the house, that daughters would remain. Sommel's team chose their terminology with deliberate care. They described Çatalhöyük as female-centred rather than matrilineal or matriarchal. The ancient DNA reveals biological kinship patterns, who is related to whom through which parent, but it cannot tell us how the living community understood its own power dynamics. Whether women ruled in any political sense remains uncertain. What is certain is that the organisational axis of the society, the principle around which households formed, persisted, and transmitted identity across generations, was female. But not everyone was satisfied with this cautious framing. Benjamin Arbuckle, an archaeologist at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, who wrote an independent commentary on the study for science, made a pointed observation. If the sex patterns were reversed, if it were sons who stayed and daughters who left, if male babies received richer burials, there would likely be little hesitation in concluding that patriarchal power structures were at play, he continued. This is reflective of the difficulty that many scholars have in imagining a world characterized by substantial female power, despite abundant archaeological, historic, and ethnographic evidence that matriarchal fields of power were and are widespread. Think about what Arbuckle is saying. He is saying that when the evidence points toward male authority, scholars accept it readily. They call it patriarchy. They treat it as a system of power. They analyze its mechanisms and its consequences. But when the same quality of evidence points toward female authority, scholars hesitate. They qualify. They use softer language. They suggest it might mean something else. The asymmetry is not in the evidence. It is in the willingness to believe. Now imagine what daily life felt like for a woman born in Çatalhöyük. She was born in a specific house, a house with walls painted in ochre and white, with platforms for sleeping and sitting, with storage bins for grain and lentils, with a hearth for cooking and warmth. Beneath the floor of this house were the bones of her grandmother, perhaps her great-grandmother, perhaps generations of women stretching back centuries, each one buried beneath the same floor, each one plastered over and kept close. This house was hers. Not in the modern legal sense of property ownership. We do not know what concepts of ownership existed at Çatalhöyük, but in the genetic, structural, social sense, this was the house of her female line. She would grow up here, she would work here, she would bear children here, and when she died, she would be buried here, added to the foundation, becoming part of the house, joining the women who came before her. Her brothers, when they grew old enough, might leave. They might join the households of the women they partnered with. Her father might have come from another house, a man who married into her mother's line, who was buried here not because it was his ancestral house, but because it was his wife's. The female figurines found throughout the site, the seated women with their hands on their breasts or bellies, the women flanked by animals, the women giving birth, take on new meaning in this light. They are not abstract symbols of a vaguely defined fertility cult. They are representations of the people around whom the entire community was organized. Portraits of power, images of the women who stayed, who maintained, who built and rebuilt and persisted. Jens Notroff, an archaeologist at the German Archaeological Institute who was not involved in the research, called the Çatalhöyük findings the first systematic evidence of such a continuously matrilineally organized Neolithic community. It is to date the oldest society where DNA evidence has confirmed a female-centered social structure. And now Sommel's team is producing similar data from even earlier sites in the region. We are now producing similar data from earlier societies, he said. Hopefully we'll have an answer soon. The answer to what? To the question that Çatalhöyük now forces us to ask, how far back does this go? If a female-centered society existed 9,000 years ago, at the dawn of agriculture, was it the continuation of an even older pattern? Was the female-centered society the original human social structure, the default from which patriarchy was a later departure? We do not know yet, but the question itself is revolutionary, because for decades the assumption ran in the other direction. Patriarchy was the default, the natural state, the inevitable consequence of biology. Any evidence of female authority was treated as the exception, the anomaly, the curiosity. Çatalhöyük reverses the burden of proof. The oldest genetically documented social organization in a food-producing society is female-centered. The patrilineal patterns that dominate later European history came after. They are the departure from the earlier norm, not the foundation. 9,000 years ago, in a city with no streets, where you entered your home through the roof and buried your dead beneath the floor, the daughters built the world, and the bones beneath the floor remember. There is a strange and bitter irony at the heart of human progress. The three technologies that made civilization possible, the three innovations without which there would be no cities, no writing, no governments, no science, no art, no history to study, were almost certainly invented by women. And in every standard history of human civilization, the credit goes elsewhere, or nowhere, or to humanity in general, which is a polite way of saying, we do not know who did it, so we will assume it was everyone, which in practice means we will imagine it was men. The first technology is agriculture. The logic of female invention is not sentimental, it is probabilistic. It is based on a simple question. Who was most likely to discover that seeds deliberately planted produce predictable crops? In hunter-gatherer societies, both those reconstructed from the archaeological record and those that have persisted into the modern era, the gathering of plant foods is overwhelmingly women's domain. Not universally, not without exception, but as a broad pattern supported by data from hundreds of documented foraging societies across every inhabited continent. Women gathered seeds, roots, tubers, fruits, nuts, leafy greens, fungi, bark, and resin. Women processed these materials, grinding, soaking, fermenting, drying, cooking, transforming raw botanical matter into edible food. Women carried this knowledge across generations, teaching their daughters and granddaughters where specific plants grew, when they ripened, which soil conditions they preferred, which were nutritious, which were toxic, and which had medicinal properties. This was not casual knowledge. This was encyclopedic, empirical, life-or-death botanical expertise accumulated over tens of thousands of years. When someone, and it had to be a specific someone, in a specific place, at a specific time, first observed that a seed dropped in fertile soil produced a new plant, and then deliberately planted seeds to create a predictable food source, rather than relying on the chance distribution of wild growth, that someone was almost certainly a woman. Not because women are inherently more observant or more innovative than men, but because the person most likely to make a discovery about plant growth was the person who spent the most time intimately handling plant material, observing seasonal patterns, and experimenting, even informally, with the conditions that promoted or inhibited growth. Margaret Ehrenberg, in her foundational 1989 book Women in Prehistory, stated it with admirable directness. The discovery of farming techniques has usually been assumed to have been made by men, but it is in fact very much more likely to have been made by women. The argument is strengthened by the archaeological context. When agriculture appears, first in the Fertile Crescent around 10,000 years ago, then independently in China, Mesoamerica, the Sahel, New Guinea, and the eastern United States, it appears alongside a constellation of associated technologies that are linked to women's labour: grinding tools, storage vessels, food processing equipment, plant fibre textiles. The entire material culture of the earliest agricultural settlements is a material culture of women's work. Tools that women used, technologies that women had been developing and refining for millennia, in the context of gathering and processing wild plant foods. Agriculture did not spring into existence from nothing. It emerged from a deep pre-existing body of botanical knowledge. And that knowledge, who had it? Who maintained it? Who passed it on? The women, the gatherers, the ones who knew the plants. The second technology is pottery. The earliest known pottery emerged in East Asia between 20,000 and 12,000 years ago, long before agriculture, long before permanent settlements, long before any of the social transformations that we associate with the Neolithic revolution. The first pots were made by hunter-gatherers, and they were made for a purpose that was central to women's domain of labour: food processing. Pottery allows you to do things with food that raw materials and open fires cannot. You can boil foods that are inedible raw: roots, tubers, tough grains, bones for broth. You can simmer complex mixtures for hours, extracting nutrients that would otherwise be inaccessible. You can store liquids, water, milk, fermented beverages, in sealed containers that protect against contamination and evaporation. You can preserve surplus food through fermentation, turning perishable raw materials into shelf-stable products that last weeks or months. Every one of these functions is a function of food processing, and food processing, in every documented pre-industrial society, is overwhelmingly women's work. The ethnographic evidence is specific and revealing. In communities where pottery is still made by hand and without the potter's wheel, which was a later invention, the potters are predominantly women. Among the Konso people of Ethiopia, women produce flaked stone tools for hide processing, tools that archaeologists had automatically attributed to male toolmakers until researchers actually observed who was using them. Among indigenous pottery traditions in sub-Saharan Africa, in South America, in Southeast Asia, in the Pacific Islands, women are the primary makers of ceramic vessels. The vessels themselves tell stories. At sites across the Neolithic Near East, pottery was decorated with increasingly complex and beautiful designs, geometric patterns, wave motifs, spiral forms, and eventually botanical imagery. Halafian pottery from northern Mesopotamia, dating to nearly 8,000 years ago, bears what may be the world's earliest botanical art, detailed, even symmetrical representations of flowers and plants rendered with a mathematical precision that suggests the makers were counting petals, calculating symmetries, and planning compositions with intellectual rigour. These pots were not mass-produced commodities, they were individual creations, each one shaped and decorated by hand, each one bearing the cognitive fingerprint of its maker. And their makers, based on the overwhelming weight of ethnographic analogy, skeletal evidence, and contextual archaeological data, were women. The third technology is weaving. And here, the evidence reaches further back in time than almost any other human technology. The earliest evidence for textile production comes from the Upper Paleolithic site of Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic. Small fragments of fired clay preserve the impressions of woven plant fibres, the negative images of threads that were pressed into the soft clay before it hardened. These impressions date to approximately 27,000 years ago. They show evidence of deliberate spinning, the twisting of plant fibres into thread, and deliberate interlacing, the crossing of those threads at right angles to produce fabric, 27,000 years ago. This is not recent history. This is deep time. These impressions are older than the last glacial maximum. They are older than the cave paintings of Lascaux. They are older than agriculture by roughly 17,000 years. Someone, in the depths of the Ice Age, in a world of glaciers and megafauna, and tiny bands of humans struggling to survive in one of the most hostile environments our species has ever faced, was spinning thread and weaving cloth. Who? The ethnographic evidence is overwhelming and consistent. In documented pre-industrial societies across the globe, in Europe, Asia, Africa, the Americas, the Pacific, textile production is women's work. Spinning, weaving, dyeing, sewing, embroidering, braiding, knotting, netting. These are skills transmitted through female networks, practiced in female spaces, associated with female identity, and performed by female hands. The archaeological evidence aligns. Spindle whorls, the small weighted discs used to maintain the rotation of a drop spindle during spinning, are found at settlement sites across the Neolithic and Bronze Age world. They are consistently associated with domestic spaces and with female burials. Loom weights, the heavy objects hung from the vertical threads of a warp-weighted loom to maintain tension during weaving, are found in the same contexts. Bone needles and awls, the tools used to sew and stitch textiles, are found in the same female-associated spaces. Together, these three technologies, agriculture, pottery and weaving, constitute the material foundation of settled human life. Without agriculture, there are no permanent settlements, no predictable food supply, no surplus to support specialization. Without pottery, there is no reliable food processing, no storage, no ability to survive between harvests, no means of preserving surplus for trade or for lean times. Without weaving, there is no efficient clothing, no containers, no rope, no nets for fishing, no sails for boats, no means of binding materials together for construction. Every civilization that has ever existed stands on this tripod. Remove any leg, and the entire structure falls, and all three legs were built by women's hands. The knowledge that made agriculture possible was women's knowledge, botanical, ecological, observational, empirical, accumulated across millennia of gathering and processing wild plants. The technology that made pottery possible was women's technology, the shaping, firing and using of clay vessels for food processing and storage. The craft that made weaving possible was women's craft, the spinning and interlacing of fibres into fabric that clothed the body, contained the goods, and bound the world together. When we tell the story of human progress, then we typically begin with the technologies that came later: the plough, the wheel, the sword, the wool, the forge, technologies associated with male labour, technologies that exploited the possibilities that women's innovations had created. We celebrate the house and forget who made the bricks. We admire the civilization and ignore the foundation, the grinding stone, the clay pot, the woven thread. These are not humble objects. They are not primitive curiosities. They are the engines of civilization itself, and they were developed, over millennia, through trial and error and observation and accumulated genius, by women who never wrote a single word, because the technology of writing had not been invented yet. When writing was finally invented, roughly 5,000 years ago, The first things recorded were inventories of grain and textile production, the products of women's labour, counted, catalogued, and credited to the institutions that controlled them, temples and palaces run by that time predominantly by men. The inventors had already been forgotten, the foundation was already invisible. The human body keeps records that no fire can burn and no flood can wash away. Not in words, not in images, in calcium and collagen and trace minerals, and the microscopic architecture of hard tissue that persists for thousands of years after the soft tissue has returned to the earth. Bones record labour, teeth record diet and work, the pelvis records childbirth, the dental calculus, the hardened plaque that accumulates on tooth surfaces over a lifetime, records what a person ate, what they breathed, and what they held in their mouth. We have already seen what the arm bones of prehistoric women reveal, strength that exceeded modern elite athletes. We have already glimpsed the dental evidence from Sur, where women's teeth bore the marks of fibre processing. But the archive goes deeper, much deeper. And consider the teeth more carefully, not just the wear from grit in hand-ground bread, though that is dramatic enough. Consider the teeth as tools, as instruments of labour that women used consciously, deliberately, as extensions of their hands. In 2020, a study of Bronze Age remains from southeastern Spain, published in the journal Archaeology, revealed that women at multiple burial sites showed distinctive wear patterns on their front teeth. Notches, chips, grooves, damage that could not have been caused by eating. Damage that was caused by gripping, pulling and processing materials with the teeth, using the front teeth as a clamp, a vice, a third hand. The researchers identified the materials being processed: plant fibres, flax, hemp, sinew, the raw materials of textile production. Women were softening fibres by pulling them between their teeth, splitting strands, stripping bark, preparing the raw inputs for spinning and weaving. 8 individuals were identified, and most of them were women. Similar evidence has been found at Neolithic sites across Europe and the Near East. At Sur, as we have seen, 71% of individuals showed evidence of using their teeth as tools, with women as prominently represented as men. Children as young as 5 showed the same patterns, suggesting that fibre processing began in early childhood, that it was a community-wide activity, and that the skills were transmitted across generations starting from the youngest possible age. In ancient Egypt, a woman buried in the city of Mendes bore toothwear so distinctive that researchers could identify her occupation from her skeleton alone. The patterns on her teeth, the specific locations and angles of wear, were consistent with the processing of papyrus reeds. This was a job that women had not previously been known to perform in ancient Egypt. Her teeth told a story that no administrative record, no tomb painting, no literary text had preserved, that at least some Egyptian women were engaged in the demanding work of manufacturing the ancient world's most important writing material. The teeth are archives. They record not just what was eaten, but what was done, and what they record overwhelmingly is work. But the most profound testimony of the female body in prehistory is not in the teeth or the arm bones, it is in the pelvis, and in the evidence of what happened there. Childbirth in the prehistoric world was the single most dangerous event in a woman's life. Not the most dangerous event she might encounter. The most dangerous event she would encounter, repeatedly, inevitably, as a normal part of her existence. There were no surgical interventions, no antibiotics for the infections that frequently followed birth, no blood transfusions for hemorrhage, the single largest cause of maternal death in the pre-modern world. No ability to perform a caesarean section on a living woman. The procedure, when it was performed in the ancient world, was done only after the mother had died, in an attempt to save the child. There was only the knowledge of the women who had attended births before, the older women, the grandmothers, the ones who knew which positions eased the passage and which prolonged it, which herbs reduced bleeding, which plants promoted uterine contraction, which preparations eased the pain without stopping the labour, which prayers or songs or rhythms calmed the terror of a first-time mother, and which distracted from the agony of a difficult delivery. This was midwifery, and it was, for millennia, the most critical medical specialisation in human existence. The archaeological evidence of childbirth mortality is sparse but devastating in its directness. Double burials, a woman and an infant interred together, The infants still positioned within or near the birth canal have been found at sites spanning thousands of years and multiple continents. In Siberia, archaeologists discovered the grave of a young woman and her twins, all three dead from a complicated labour dating to roughly 7,000 years ago. The positioning of the bones tells the story. The first twin had been partially delivered, the second had not descended, and the mother had died of exhaustion or hemorrhage or both, with one child halfway into the world and the other still inside her. In Egypt, a 3,700-year-old burial contained a pregnant woman, her unborn child still within her pelvis, both lost before delivery began. Something, an infection, a complication, a sudden catastrophe, had killed them both before the child could be born. These are the cases we can identify, the ones where the physical evidence is unambiguous, but they represent only the most extreme fraction of maternal deaths. The far more common scenario, a mother dying from postpartum hemorrhage hours after delivery, or from puerperal fever days later, or from complications that are invisible in the skeleton, leaves no distinctive archaeological trace. Researchers at the Australian National University developed the first method for estimating maternal mortality rates in prehistoric populations by analysing skeletal demographics, the ratio of female deaths in childbearing age to the overall population structure. Their findings suggest that maternal death rates in pre-modern societies may have been as high as 1% per birth event, or even higher in populations experiencing nutritional stress or high rates of infectious disease. 1% per birth may sound small. It is not small. Dear, a woman who gave birth 5 times faced a cumulative risk of approximately 5%. 6 births, 6%. 7 births, approaching 7%. In a world where 5 to 7 births per woman was common and necessary, given high rates of infant and child mortality, the lifetime risk of dying from childbirth was a constant, unignorable presence in every woman's consciousness. And yet they bore children. They bore children and returned to the grinding stone the next day, or the day after, or as soon as their bodies could move, because the grain still needed grinding, and the animals still needed tending, and the community still needed every pair of hands. The concept of a recovery period, weeks of rest, gradual return to activity, protected recuperation, was a luxury that the archaeological evidence does not support. Women's bones from these periods sometimes show markers of pregnancy, subtle changes in the pelvis and lumbar spine, co-occurring with evidence of continuous heavy labour. They did not stop working for pregnancy. They worked through it, around it, despite it. And in this crucible of labour and pain and survival, they developed the knowledge that would eventually become the foundation of medicine itself. The connection between women and healing is one of the oldest threads in human culture. It predates civilization by tens of thousands of years. Neanderthal dental calculus from 49,000 years ago, analysed through the miracle of ancient biomolecular chemistry, has been found to contain traces of plants with salicylic acid. Salicylic acid is the chemical precursor of aspirin. It reduces pain and inflammation. Someone, and 49,000 years ago, before our species had even replaced the Neanderthals in Europe, knew that certain plants reduced pain, and they were using those plants deliberately. The plant residue was in their teeth, because they were chewing the medicine. 8,000-year-old finds from a site in Brazil reveal a curated selection of medicinal plants, not random food items, but a deliberate pharmacological toolkit. Plants for digestive problems, plants for intestinal parasites, plants for pain relief, plants for wound treatment, plants for respiratory illness. This was not folk superstition. This was empirical medicine. Treatments selected because they worked, maintained because they continued to work, passed from one healer to the next across generations. The Mesolithic hunter-gatherers in Scandinavia chewed birch tar, a substance with powerful antiseptic properties. When researchers extracted and sequenced the ancient DNA preserved in a piece of birch tar found at a Danish site, they discovered that the person who had been chewing it had active mouth infections, conditions that the antiseptic properties of birch tar would have helped treat. The women who carried this pharmacological knowledge were not witches. They were not mystics. They were not quaint folk practitioners operating on faith and superstition. They were empirical scientists working without instruments, without laboratories, without any of the infrastructure we consider essential to scientific inquiry. They observed which plants produced which effects in the human body. They tested dosages through careful, generation-spanning experimentation. They accumulated data across centuries and transmitted it with enough precision that the treatments worked, reliably enough to be maintained, refined, and expanded over time. They managed fertility with plant-based contraceptives. Ancient Egyptian texts, which drew on much older oral traditions, describe thick plant pastes used as vaginal barriers to prevent conception. Indigenous women across the world developed herbal preparations that prevented pregnancy, terminated early pregnancies, regulated menstrual cycles, and managed the pain and complications of miscarriage. This was reproductive medicine, women's medicine, created by women, for women, in a world where male physicians would not exist for thousands of years. They managed childbirth with herbs that eased labour, promoted uterine contraction, reduced postpartum bleeding, and treated the infections that killed so many new mothers. They knew which plants were dangerous and which were safe. They knew the difference between a dose that helped and a dose that harmed. They calibrated their treatments with a sophistication that we are only now beginning to appreciate, as modern pharmacology rediscovers the active compounds in the same plants that prehistoric women were using millennia ago. The body was their textbook, pain was their laboratory, and the knowledge they produced, without instruments, without writing, without institutional support, without recognition, was sophisticated enough to keep communities alive through ice ages and famines and epidemics and the relentless ordinary dangers of daily life. Their own bodies were the price of this knowledge. Their worn teeth and reshaped bones and scarred pelvises and calloused hands. Every loaf of bread cost a gram of enamel. Every surviving child cost a risk of death. Every year of a labour cost a fraction of the skeleton. The body was both the instrument and the archive, and when we finally learned to read it, what it told us was not a story of passivity or domesticity or gentle, undemanding existence. It told us a story of strength and endurance and quiet, relentless, unrecognized genius. A story written in bone. By the time writing appears, scratched into wet clay tablets in the cities of Sumer, around 3400 BC, women have already been running the world for thousands of years. They have already invented agriculture and pottery and weaving. They have already built the knowledge systems that make settled life possible. They have already survived for millennia on the strength of their bodies and the depth of their botanical and material expertise. But the arrival of writing creates a paradox. For the first time, we can see individual women in the historical record, named, described, their activities documented in cuneiform impressions on clay tablets. We can read letters they wrote. We can study contracts they signed. We can examine legal codes that defined their rights and obligations. The technology of literacy makes women visible in a way that the preceding 10,000 years of archaeology could only approximate. And yet, the same societies that created writing also created formal hierarchies of power, hierarchies that increasingly defined women as subordinate to men, that codified male authority in law and religion, that systematized the control of female labour and female reproduction in ways that earlier, less complex societies had not. The visibility is real. The constraints are also real, and reading the evidence of early civilizations requires holding both truths simultaneously, seeing the women who worked and created and managed and led, while also seeing the systems that were tightening around them. Start with beer, because beer is where the irony is most delicious. Beer in ancient Mesopotamia was not a luxury. It was not a recreational drink, it was a dietary staple. A thick, nutritious, grain-based beverage that provided calories, B vitamins, and safe hydration in an era when standing water was often contaminated with parasites and bacteria. Beer was so central to the Mesopotamian economy that one of the earliest known written documents, a clay tablet from Uruk dating to approximately 3200 BC, records the distribution of beer rations from institutional storerooms. And beer was women's work. The Sumerian hymn to Ninkasi, one of the oldest known songs in human history, is addressed to the goddess of beer. It is, in practical terms, a brewing recipe rendered in poetic form, describing the preparation of bapir, a twice-baked barley bread used as a brewing ingredient, the mashing process, and the fermentation of the final product. The hymn is addressed to a female deity. The process it describes was performed by female brewers. Cuneiform administrative tablets from the Ur III period describe female labourers managing the brewing process from start to finish, carrying ale from the brewery, supervising fermentation, distributing the finished product, The association between women and brewing persisted across cultures and millennia. In ancient Egypt, beer was brewed domestically, and the brewers were predominantly women. In Celtic and Germanic Europe, brewing was women's work until the Middle Ages, when the professionalization and commercialization of the industry gradually transferred control to men. In pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, women brewed chicha, a fermented maize beverage, as a central economic and ceremonial activity. Women did not merely make beer, they controlled one of the most important production processes in the ancient world, the biochemical transformation of raw grain into a shelf-stable, calorie-dense, socially significant product that lubricated commerce, religion, and daily life. Beyond brewing, the range of women's economic activity in early civilizations was staggering. In Mesopotamia, women are recorded in cuneiform texts as holding an extraordinary diversity of occupations: landowners, business owners, administrators, bureaucrats, doctors, scribes, priestesses, artists, artisans, bakers, basket makers, cupbearers, dancers, estate managers, farmers, goldsmiths, jewellery makers, merchants, musicians, perfume makers, potters, tavern owners, and weavers. This is not the profile of a subordinate class. This is the profile of a population embedded in every sector of the economy. The Naditu women of ancient Babylon were a particularly striking example. These women, attached to temples, often from elite families, took vows that sometimes included celibacy and were freed from the obligations of marriage and childbearing. In exchange, they managed substantial business enterprises. They bought and sold property. They made loans. They invested in commercial ventures. They accumulated personal wealth. The Naditu were, in modern terms, professional women, financially independent, economically powerful, and operating within a religious framework that legitimized their autonomy. In the Assyrian period, female administrators known as Sakintu managed the textile workshops that supplied the international trade networks linking the city of Ashur to the commercial colony of Karam Kanesh in Anatolia, a distance of over 1,000 kilometers. These women supervised every stage of production: the preparation of raw wool, the spinning, the weaving, the dyeing, the finishing, and handled the commercial correspondence that coordinated shipment and sale. They were, by any standard, executives. In Egypt, the evidence is equally rich. The workers' village of Deir el-Medina, near the Valley of the Kings, has yielded thousands of ostraca, pottery fragments and limestone flakes used as a cheap writing surface for everyday correspondence. These ostraca contain letters written by and to women, business transactions, complaints about neighbours, requests for supplies, discussions of household management, arguments about property. One extraordinary document records the will of a woman named Naunakti, who lived in Deir el-Medina during the reign of Rameses V, around 1150 BC. Naunakta was not a queen. She was not a priestess. She was not wealthy by the standards of the elite. She was an ordinary woman in a workers' community, and she had the legal authority to write a will, to determine the disposition of her property after her death, to name her heirs, and to disinherit children who had failed to care for her in her old age. The will is specific. Naunakta names each child individually. She specifies exactly what each heir will receive, and she explicitly excludes certain children, or stating that they did not support her when she was elderly, and therefore forfeited their inheritance. This is a woman exercising legal, economic, and moral authority over her own estate, 3,000 years ago, in a society that modern textbooks describe as patriarchal. In Pompeii, frozen in time by the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD, the archaeological record preserves a snapshot of women's daily lives with extraordinary specificity. Assalina owned a popular thermopolium, a fast food tavern, where she and her assistants served hot food and drink to the working population of the city. Julia Felix owned a large commercial complex that included a private bathhouse, rental apartments, and shops, a real estate empire managed by a single woman. Eumakia, a wealthy wool processor, accumulated enough personal fortune to finance a major public building in the central forum of Pompeii, one of only a few women in the Roman world known to have funded public architecture. Graffiti on the walls of Pompeii preserved the voices of women in a way that formal historical sources rarely do. Campaign slogans urged citizens to vote for specific political candidates, and some of these slogans were posted by women, including the tavern workers of Assalina's establishment, who publicly endorsed a candidate and encouraged their customers to support him. Women could not vote in Rome, but they could influence the votes of men who ate their food and drank their wine. The paradox of early civilizations is that they gave women visibility while simultaneously constructing the ideological and legal frameworks that would constrain them. The Code of Hammurabi defines women as, in certain contexts, the property of their husbands. The same code specifies women's rights to divorce, to own property, and to pursue economic activity. The laws are not monolithically oppressive. They are complex, contradictory, and revealing, a reflection of societies that needed women's labour and knowledge, but were simultaneously developing systems to control it. The transition from prehistory to history is not, for women, a story of liberation or a story of subjugation. It is a story of negotiation, a constant millennia-long negotiation between women's indispensable, productive and reproductive contributions and the patriarchal systems that sought to claim the benefits of those contributions while denying women full credit and autonomy. The beer was brewed by women. The textiles were woven by women. The medical knowledge was accumulated by women. The households were managed by women. The administrative infrastructure of the earlier cities relied on women's organizational intelligence and economic participation. They were not peripheral to civilization. They were load-bearing. Remove their labor, remove their knowledge, and the entire structure collapses. From the brewery to the temple to the trading post to the household to the grave. There is a particular kind of power that does not announce itself. It does not wear armor. It does not sit on a throne. It does not issue decrees or lead armies or build monuments to its own glory. It operates through the hands, through the daily, repetitive, unglamorous work of making something that other people need and cannot produce for themselves. This is the power of production, and for most of human history it was women's power. Nowhere is this clearer than in the story of textiles. The thread that connects the woven impressions at Dolny Vestonis, 27,000 years ago, to the industrial mills of the 18th century runs through women's hands at every point. For tens of thousands of years, the production of cloth, from raw fibre to finished fabric, was women's exclusive domain. Men did not spin, men did not weave. In most cultures, men did not even enter the spaces where spinning and weaving took place. The production of the material that clothed the body, insulated the home, carried the goods, and, as we will see, functioned as currency itself was entirely in female hands. The implications of this exclusivity are enormous, and they reach their most vivid expression in the medieval North Atlantic. Michelle Heyer-Smith is an archaeologist who spent years doing something that no previous researcher had thought to do, taking textile fragments seriously. At archaeological sites across Iceland, Greenland, the Faroe Islands, and Scandinavia, excavations had yielded countless small scraps of fabric, fragments of cloth preserved by the cold, acidic soils of the subarctic. Previous archaeologists had catalogued these fragments, bagged them, and stored them in museum collections. Some had been studied briefly, most had been ignored. They were too small, too degraded, too apparently unremarkable to warrant serious analysis. Heyer-Smith disagreed. She collected and analysed literally thousands of fragments, thousands of soil-encrusted pieces as she described them, using microscopic examination of thread counts, weave structures, fibre diameters, and spin directions. She measured each fragment with the precision of a forensic examiner. She radiocarbon dated key samples, and she cross-referenced her physical findings with medieval Icelandic law codes and inventories, documents that specified, with surprising precision, the characteristics that cloth had to meet to be accepted as legal tender. Because in medieval Iceland, cloth was money, not metaphorically. It was not as a luxury trade good, as actual standardized currency. The primary medium of exchange in the Icelandic economy, from the 12th through the 17th centuries, was a specific type of homespun woolen fabric called vadmal. It was used to pay taxes, to pay tithes to the church, to buy land, to buy livestock, to settle debts and legal judgments. It was traded internationally, exported to England and continental Europe in quantities large enough to clothe armies and urban populations. Vadmal had specifications, legal specifications. The Icelandic law codes defined the thread count, the weave type, the spin direction, and the acceptable weight of legal cloth. These specifications were precise: 4 to 15 warp threads per centimetre, a specific tabby weave structure, a consistent Z-twist or S-twist in the yarn. Here Smith found that the physical fragments in the archaeological record match the legal specifications exactly. From the 12th century onward, every textile she analysed from every site across the North Atlantic fell within the same tight range of standardised measurements. This was not accidental. This was industrial standardisation, the deliberate production of a consistent product to meet a defined standard. And women made all of it. Every strand of yarn was spun by a woman's hands on a drop spindle. Every metre of cloth was woven by a woman's hands on a warp-weighted loom. Every piece of vadmal that changed hands as currency, that paid for a plot of land or a herd of sheep or a passage on a ship, was manufactured by a woman who knew the specifications, who maintained the quality, who produced the economic lifeblood of her society. Women were making the money, Hayor Smith said, and she meant it literally. The weaving hut, called a dingja in Old Norse, was a space saturated with female power. It was where the loom stood. It was where women gathered to spin and weave and talk and plan. And it was taboo. Men did not enter the dingja. Saga literature and mythological sources describe the weaving space as charged with feminine energy, so potent that a man who entered might lose his masculinity or even his life. The Daradaliod, a poem from Njal Saga, describes Valkyries weaving the fate of warriors on a loom strung with human entrails, using severed heads as loom weights. The image is horrifying and magnificent. And it tells us something essential about how the Norse world understood the power that resided in the act of weaving. This was not merely superstition. The taboo served a practical function. It gave women exclusive control over the means of economic production. If men could not enter the space where currency was manufactured, then women held a monopoly on the money supply. It is difficult to imagine a more fundamental form of economic power, and the women adapted their production to changing conditions with a sophistication that Hayor Smith could see in the physical structure of each individual fragment. At the Greenlandic site of Tatsipataya, she analysed textile fragments spanning several centuries, a period that included the onset of the Little Ice Age, when temperatures across the North Atlantic dropped significantly. Using radiocarbon dating and correlation with published climate records, she was able to track changes in weaving technique over time. What she found was that as the climate cooled, women shifted their weaving from balanced tabby weaves to weft-dominant structures, fabrics where the horizontal threads significantly outnumber the vertical, creating a denser, warmer, more insulating material. This was not a passive response. It was a deliberate, technically informed adaptation. The women of medieval Greenland assessed the changing conditions of their environment, analysed the thermal properties of different weave structures, and modified their production techniques to meet the new reality. Hayor Smith could see their decision-making preserved in the ratio of weft to warp threads in each fragment. "I could see in the piece of cloth," she said, her voice vibrating with the excitement of discovery, "the actual deliberate decision-making that women were doing, like it's getting cold. Let's change the way we weave our cloth." Each thread was a decision. Each weave pattern was a solution to a problem, and the cumulative effect of millions of these decisions, made by thousands of women across centuries, in isolated farmsteads and coastal settlements and Arctic outposts where the margin between survival and death was measured in the warmth of a garment, was an economic and technological system that sustained entire civilizations. This pattern extends far beyond the Viking world. In ancient Greece, textile production was so central to female identity that spinning and weaving metaphors pervaded every aspect of the culture. Homer's Penelope weaves and unweaves her shroud for 20 years, stalling the suitors who threaten her household, using the loom as a weapon of strategy and survival. Athena is the goddess of both wisdom and weaving, a pairing that tells us everything about how the Greeks understood the intellectual demands of textile production. Women's funerary monuments depict the deceased with wool baskets and spindles, symbols not of confinement, but of productive capacity and social worth. In pre-Columbian Peru, textile production reached a level of technical sophistication that rivals anything achieved in the ancient world. Women produced cloth so fine, so densely woven, so intricately patterned that the Spanish conquistadors, who had seen the silk workshops of Italy and the tapestry ateliers of Flanders, were astonished. And some Andean textiles contain as many as 500 threads per inch. They use complex techniques, supplementary warp, discontinuous weft, double cloth, that require mathematical planning of extraordinary precision. They are, in every meaningful sense, works of engineering, and they were made by women. The thread that connects all of these examples, from the Ice Age impressions at Dolní Věstonice to the Vadmal of medieval Iceland to the masterworks of Andean weaving, is this. Textile production was, for most of human history, the economic activity that women owned entirely. It was their skill, their space, their knowledge, their labour, their power. And it was, time and again, across cultures and millennia and continents, the economic backbone of civilizations. When we talk about women's history being hidden, this is what we mean. Not hidden as in deliberately concealed, hidden as in systematically undervalued. The labour that made the money, that clothed the body, that insulated against cold, that enabled trade, that paid the taxes, this labour was performed by women, and it was so fundamental, so constant, so completely embedded in the fabric of daily existence, that it became invisible, like air, like gravity, like the ground beneath your feet, indispensable, and therefore unnoticed, until someone picks up a scrap of cloth from a museum shelf, dusts off the centuries, puts it under a microscope, and sees the fingerprints of the women who built the world. Here is the mystery that has been building beneath every chapter of this story, growing louder with each revelation, each corrected assumption, each bone and tooth and thread that tells us something we should have known all along. The evidence existed. It always existed. The bones were in the ground, the teeth were in the skulls, the hand stencils were on the cave walls, visible to anyone with a lamp and the curiosity to enter. The textile fragments were in the museum storerooms, bagged and labelled and gathering dust. The law codes mentioned women by name. The administrative tablets recorded their businesses. The burials contained hunting tools beside female skeletons. The figurines depicted female bodies with care and reverence and detail. None of this was secret. None of this was destroyed. And none of this was locked in a vault accessible only to the privileged few. It was all there, in plain sight, for anyone to find. And yet, for over a century of modern archaeology and anthropology and history, for the entire span of time in which the professional study of the past has existed, the default story remained the same. Men built civilization, and women waited. How? The answer is not a conspiracy. It is not a deliberate program of suppression carried out by identifiable villains. The answer is something more pervasive, more subtle, and infinitely harder to eradicate than any conspiracy. It is the accumulated weight of unexamined assumptions. Assumptions so deeply embedded in the structure of academic thought, in the training of researchers, in the design of research questions, in the criteria for what counts as important evidence, that they did not register as assumptions at all. They registered as facts, as common sense, as the obvious, natural, self-evident truth about how the world works and has always worked. The first assumption was the man-the-hunter paradigm, established at the 1966 Chicago Conference, codified in a canonical book, absorbed into the curriculum of every anthropology department on Earth, and defended with institutional ferocity for half a century. The paradigm did not merely argue that men hunted, it argued that hunting was the engine of human evolution, the activity that drove the development of bipedalism, tool use, language, and social cooperation. And since hunting was defined as a male, human evolution itself was defined as a male story. Women were passengers, men were drivers. The paradigm was not built on evidence, it was built on the absence of evidence, and on the assumption that the absence confirmed what the researchers already believed. When female skeletons were found with hunting tools, the evidence was reinterpreted. When ethnographic reports described women hunting, the reports were dismissed as anomalies. When physiological analysis showed that female bodies had endurance advantages, the analysis was ignored. The paradigm functioned as a filter. Any evidence that contradicted it was automatically weakened, while any evidence that supported it was automatically strengthened. This is not science. This is confirmation bias operating at an institutional scale, and it persisted for 50 years. The second assumption was the comparative framework. Female bones compared to male bones, as with the male pattern treated as the standard and the female pattern treated as the deviation. This single methodological choice, which seems technical and neutral but is neither, rendered women's physical labour invisible for over a century. It was not until 2017 that Alison McIntosh created a female-specific baseline and discovered that the arm bones of Neolithic women exceeded those of elite modern athletes. The data had been there all along. The framework to see it had not. The third assumption was the hierarchy of artifacts. Grinding stones were classified as domestic tools. Weapons were classified as significant artifacts. Spindle whorls were catalogued and filed. Swords were displayed and celebrated. The material culture of women's labour, the pottery, the textiles, the food processing equipment, was categorised as mundane. The material culture of men's labour, the weapons, the metal tools, the monumental architecture, was categorised as evidence of civilization. The hierarchy of objects mirrored the hierarchy of gender, and both hierarchies reinforced each other in a self-perpetuating loop. The fourth assumption, and the most damaging in the long term, was the dismissal of women's knowledge. The pharmacological expertise that kept communities alive for millennia was not called science, it was called folk medicine. The agricultural knowledge that made the Neolithic revolution possible was not called innovation, it was called instinct. The engineering intelligence that produced textiles of extraordinary complexity was not called technology, it was called craft. The pattern is consistent. When a man performed an activity, and it was given a name that connoted intelligence, significance, and achievement, when a woman performed the same activity, or a more complex version of it, it was given a name that connoted tradition, simplicity, and domesticity. When a man made a spear point, it was called tool-making. When a woman made a pot that transformed raw grain into edible food and made settled life possible, it was called handicraft. When a man killed an animal, it was called an achievement of human evolution. When a woman developed a plant-based contraceptive that gave her control over her own fertility, it was called folk belief. When a man built a wall, it was called architecture. When a woman wove a textile of 500 threads per inch using mathematical calculations that would challenge a modern engineer, it was called women's work. The language itself was a tool of erasure, and it was so effective that even women internalized it. The devaluation of domestic labour, of textile production, of food processing, of childcare, of botanical knowledge. This devaluation did not begin in the modern era. It has been growing for millennia, gathering weight and momentum as patriarchal systems consolidated power and systematically transferred credit for women's contributions to male-controlled institutions. The fifth dimension of the erasure is silence, the absence of women's voices from the written record, not because women had nothing to say, but because for most of human history, writing was controlled by men, and the things women knew and did were not considered worthy of documentation. When we have women's voices in Egyptian ostraca, in Mesopotamian legal tablets, in Pompeian graffiti, they're extraordinary, vivid, fully human, completely engaged with the world around them. But these voices are fragments, islands of visibility in an ocean of silence. The correction is happening now. It is happening in Alison McIntosh's lab in Cambridge, where CT scanners reveal the hidden strength of ancient women's bones. It is happening in Dean Snow's analysis of hand stencils, reattributing the oldest art in human history. It is happening in Kara Okerbach's physiology research, dismantling the biological arguments for the man-the-hunter model. It is happening in Mehmet Somel's DNA laboratory, revealing the female-centered organization of Çatalhöyük. It is happening in Michelle Hayer Smith's textile analysis, uncovering the economic sovereignty of Viking-era women. It is happening at excavation sites around the world where a new generation of archaeologists, many of them women, are asking different questions and finding different answers. But the correction is slow. Textbooks take years to rewrite. Museum exhibits take decades to redesign. Popular culture absorbs new science at the pace of continental drift. The image of the caveman with his spear and the cavewoman with her basket is still, tonight, the default image in most people's minds. It is in every children's book, every cartoon, every casual reference to prehistoric life. It will take generations to replace. What can be replaced right now, tonight, in the time it takes to hear these words, is the question. Not what did early women do, as though the answer might be not much, as though the question itself is a curiosity, a minor addendum to the real story of human history. But what didn't they do? Because the honest answer, the answer that the evidence demands with the full weight of bones and teeth and thread and ochre, is almost nothing. There is almost nothing in the building of human civilization that women did not do, invent, develop, maintain, manage, produce, transmit, and sustain. They ground the grain, they hunted the game, they made the art, they invented agriculture, they shaped the pots, they spun the thread and wove the cloth, they healed the sick and delivered the babies and treated the wounds and managed the fevers. They bore children and buried children and carried the grief of both. They built the economies, they maintained the lineages, they adapted to every change that the climate and the landscape and the human community threw at them. And they did it with bodies that were stronger than elite modern athletes, and minds that carried encyclopedic knowledge without a single written word. They did it all day, every day, for thousands upon thousands of years. The only thing they did not do was write the history books. Someone else did that. And someone else decided what was worth remembering. Somewhere, in a museum drawer in Cambridge, in a climate-controlled storage facility in Berlin, in a sealed archive beneath a university in Ankara, there is a small piece of bone. It is the humerus of a woman who lived 7,000 years ago. It is not dramatic to look at. It is not gold or jade or polished marble. It does not gleam. It does not impress the casual visitor who glances at it and moves on to the bronze swords and the gold torques and the towering stone sculptures that fill the public galleries. It is just a bone, yellowed with age, light in the hand, slightly rough along the shaft where the periosteum has flaked away over millennia. But inside that bone, written in mineral density and cortical thickness, and the microscopic geometry of cross-sectional area, is a record of extraordinary labour. On the 5 hours a day at the grinding stone, hauling water from the stream to the settlement and back again, jar after heavy jar, tending livestock in the heat and the cold, planting and harvesting by hand, bent over fields of emmer wheat with a flint sickle, processing hides into leather, scraping and stretching and softening until the material yielded to her will, spinning wool into thread on a handheld spindle, weaving that thread into cloth on a loom made of wood and stone, all of it inscribed in calcium phosphate, in the remodelled architecture of living tissue, in the way the bone grew and thickened and strengthened itself around the demands of a life that never stopped requiring everything she had. She's not alone in that drawer. She is one of millions, an unbroken chain of women stretching back through the Neolithic and the Mesolithic and the Upper Paleolithic, all the way to the first moment when a female hand pressed against a cave wall and left its outline in red ochre. Tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of women, an archive of labour and intelligence and endurance and creativity and survival that is older than agriculture, older than pottery, older than writing, older than anything we call civilization. We are only now, or in our own generation, in our own century, and are beginning to read this archive. And what it tells us is this: the story we were told was wrong. Not wrong in its facts, necessarily. The dates are roughly right, the sites are real, the artifacts are genuine, but wrong in its emphasis, wrong in its framework, or wrong in its fundamental assumptions about who mattered, whose labour counted, whose intelligence was real, and whose contributions were essential. The story placed men at the centre and women at the periphery. It defined civilization as a product of male invention: the plough, the wheel, the sword, the wall, the throne, and treated women's contributions as background, as context, as the scenery against which the real drama played out. The bones say otherwise, the teeth say otherwise, the cave walls say otherwise, the DNA of Çatalhöyük, daughters inheriting the house, baby girls receiving richer grave goods, the female line persisting through 1,000 years of continuous occupation, says otherwise. The textile fragments of the medieval North Atlantic, vadmal cloth that served as currency, and woven by women's hands to legal specifications, in weaving huts that men feared to enter, say otherwise. The 63 foraging societies where women hunted, intentionally and regularly, with spears and nets and fire and dogs, they say otherwise. The estrogen in a woman's blood, the hormone that makes her a better endurance hunter than any man of equivalent fitness, that protects her cells and fuels her muscles and sustains her over distances that would break a sprinter, it says otherwise. The pharmacological knowledge preserved in dental calculus, traces of medicinal plants ground between teeth 49,000 years ago, says otherwise. Everything says otherwise. The women who ground the grain were not performing a minor domestic task. They were performing the most physically demanding, time-consuming, of absolutely essential daily labour in the Neolithic world, and they did it with arms stronger than those of Olympic athletes, for 5,500 years straight. The women who pressed their hands against cave walls were not leaving idle marks. They were creating the first art in human history, and 3/4 of those hands were theirs. The women who hunted were not engaging in an occasional exception. They were participating in a subsistence strategy that was common, valued, and physiologically optimized for their bodies. The women who invented agriculture, pottery, and weaving did not stumble upon these technologies by accident. They developed them through generations of accumulated observation, experimentation, and knowledge transmission. The same process we call science when men do it. What early women actually did all day was everything. Everything that mattered. Everything that survival required. Everything that civilization was eventually built upon. They did it with their hands and their teeth and their backs and their minds. They did it while pregnant, while nursing, while carrying children, while grieving children, while teaching children, while preparing children for the same life of labour and knowledge and endurance that they themselves had been living since they were old enough to kneel at their mother's side and learn the rhythm of the grinding stone. And when the day was over, when the grain was ground and the water was carried and the children were fed and the fire was banked and the cloth was woven and the sick were tended and the animals were settled, they rested. They rested in bodies that would become the archive, bodies that would wait, patient and silent in the earth for thousands of years until someone finally thought to ask the right question. Not, what did men do and what did women do to help, but what did women do as the main question, the central question, the question that should have been asked first, every time, from the very beginning of the study of the human past. This is their hidden history. And now, after 7,000 years of silence, it is not hidden anymore. The bones have spoken, the teeth have testified, the cave walls have been read, the DNA has been decoded, the threads have been counted, the archive is open, and what it says, what it has been saying all along to anyone willing to listen, is that the world you live in, the food you eat, the clothes you wear, the knowledge you carry, the language you speak, the art you admire, the civilization you inhabit, all of it, every last piece of it, rests on a foundation that women built. Not as helpers, not as assistants, not as the supporting cast in someone else's story, as the builders, the inventors, the keepers, the ones who did the work. Sleep well tonight. And if you dream, dream of strong hands, ancient hands, calloused hands, hands that ground the grain and wove the cloth and pressed against cold stone in the dark and said, without a single word, something that echoes across every century between then and now. I was here. I did this. Remember me. You come from them, every one of you, and they are not gone. They are in your bones, in the shape of your hands, in the strength you did not know you had. They have always been there. They were just waiting for someone to listen.